and still a beginning is a very difficult thing. A delicate thing. A delicate thing. Uh,
Jinx.
yeah. Yeah. And speaking of how to start an episode other than the means by which we have started our episodes, and yet still somehow reify that it is the start of an episode.
Well, that thing about don't wait to be confident to show up until you're confident. I feel that could also apply to like organization or enthusiasm sometimes as well.
Oh, it's well, then you're like doing the Picasso thing, right? Of inspiration will come, but it has to find you working.
Yeah, yeah.
So in other words, acting, which is, ultimately the ultimate in like disingenuous performance. And therefore, yeah, anyway, I don't know. Hi. Hello, everyone. Uh,
Hello.
if you want to talk about performativity and didn't know you wanted to, this is the perfect place to do so. Uh, because anyway, hello and welcome to Radio Free Golgotha, episode 37th. Hi, Al.
Hello.
We are Zoom chatted, moose tact. I was trying to say things backwards, like a proper Lewis Carrollian uh, aficionado, but instead I'm confused and Lewis Carroll's problematic. But yes, okay, hi, for the very fourth time. We are doing this lovely episode, the 37th episode of Radio Free Golgotha, centered around the feast of St Ignatius Loyola. So happy Iggy Day to those who celebrate. Um, I like this growing trend of like good morning to those who celebrate,
Mhm.
or to those who celebrate being almost like in accordance with the prophecy.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so I also was Doug called me out that you specifically seem to have a wonderful set of notes and agenda, and I am the ADHD goat who is barreling through your garden, Mr. McGregor, which is a Peter Rabbit reference. But I'm okay with that. But I'm also like, man, I feel like we can spur off each other and go off into tangents. But I'm thankful for the notes that are the rows of your carrots, if that's the case.
Oh, bless you.
And
Thank you.
yeah, and fuck you, Doug. Fuck you.
No one asked for your sage wisdom.
Yeah, that's right. Nobody wanted an accurate description of my life, purpose, and work.
Oh, to hold
All right, so what are we doing today? We are talking about St. Ignatius of Loyola,
Mm-hmm.
Inigo, which is also the name of one of my goats.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes called Inigo.
He's a little
But
guy.
yeah, he's a little guy. He's a little one. July 31st, his death day. So,
Mhm.
in accordance with as apparently what we do as Catholic and the larger Catholic culture is celebrate that entrance into heaven. Uh, but so he is our saint for the day. Our demon is Haristum, or
Mm-hmm.
corresponding Eshu, which is Eshu Brasa,
Mm-hmm.
Eshu burning ember, burning coal. The plant or herb is frankincense. Did you see, speaking of the ADHD goat, that herb is actually an overcorrection, and that the word originally etymologically is just herb, but an H was added in because it made it seem like there should be an H there.
Oh,
And
really?
then the American pronunciation is closer to the older pronunciation. Yeah,
That's awesome. I didn't see that, but that's yeah, another
yeah,
great example of exactly that.
yeah. Bactributions and backronyms and things like that.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so the herb being frankincense, or just sometimes, as we like to call it, incense.
Yep.
The stone or mineral is flint. The
Mm-hmm.
magic is that of calcination, which is the turning things to fire, not necessarily turning them to calcium. Uh, the figure of the day is Fortuna Major, and its corresponding Odu, which is Owani Meiji. The arcanum of the tarot is Temperance, and
Mm-hmm.
the magician, the dead magician, take a shot, is Anton LaVey,
Mm-hmm.
who is an interesting choice that we haven't done before. Um, I
Yeah,
kind of feel
it's nice to do some of the more modern ones, right? We've got more actual records and things like that.
real people. Then we might offend people though too. Uh,
Delicious. Well,
give
it's a
it, give
fiery.
it as much as we have offended thousands and thousands, but please only ourselves. Um,
Well, it's
uh,
a fiery episode, right? So like
yeah, absolutely.
a little inflammatory, an inflammatory character, right? So
And who doesn't want to base an entire religious identity off of Don Rickles performing, Bad Magician, uh, 60s Western?
yeah,
So
I didn't realize that Wild Wild West was anything other than a Will Smith movie and the tombstone of Kevin Kline's
Oh,
movie acting career.
how dare you? How dare you, sir?
Well, he's still
But
Mr. Fish Odor, so he's
that's
he's
true.
doing fine.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So, episode 37. Here we go. All right. So, Ignatius Loyola, and this is one of those times where we were. This is a saint that I love because there's so much meat around him, and then the spiritual order and practices that he developed,
Mm,
and then the conspiracy theories kick in as to who the Jesuits are and what they do.
mm,
And I like that there are many layers to this, but all starting with Inigo, the little one, as he were sort of in that way. So Loyola is an interesting one because as anybody in any Catholic school can attest, there's always, if it wasn't your school, there was always another school called Loyola that had excellent reputation for their academics and their sports in the Catholic sphere near you. Um, but Ignatius Loyola in Basque, Ignacio Loyola. But Ignacio is Inigo. Inigo is the name he was baptized with, which is little one. It might have something to do with Ignatius and going into kind of the de-Latinization of things and the common making romance and things like that, but its exposure to other languages. So there is some reference to it being fiery, which is what
yeah.
his name means, which Ignatius itself means fiery. Um, but there's also Inigo itself. Igo has a diminutive status, like similar to Ito in Spanish, or Yo, like in Basque, where they would palatize things. So anyway, you also have the wonderful thing of it being Inigo Montoya, being the Inigo that more people are familiar with, right, of Princess Bride fame. So it's the same name, Inigo Lopez de Oñas y Loyola, born in Loyola, the village, which is really named for the Castilla, the tower that is there. So it's like a village, but it's really just a giant fortress that's on the outskirts of Aspetia in Guipúzcoa, in Basque Country in Spain. So he is one of 13 children,
Yeah.
and born into the fortress of Loyola. One of the things about Basque culture that's fun things is that you're named for the house, right? So if you're born in this house, that's your name. This is still part of the culture. This concept of coming in and kind of Romanizing things where the family could endure beyond that physical structure of the house does start to affect. And Loyola is a complex figure because even when I remember being there in 2021, and my teacher, my language teacher was pointing to the Loyolas and being like, they're a complex family because of their part in the Bando Guerra, the Guerra de los Bandos, the War of the Bands. So there's a series of blood feuds that start happening in the late Middle Ages, Basque Country, Cantabria, Gascony, Navarro. So there's all these areas that are all kind of coming under a new way of doing things that is breaking out of just the pastoral kind of warlord hoarding that was there, and it's kind of bringing into nobility. So anybody with a coat of arms in Basque Country was like, well, they sold themselves off to the other ethnicities, the other groups. So there's a lot of interesting lore there. If you want to get into the War of the Bands, it's a really interesting period in that era of Spanish history. But his family was involved in this. So if you go to the shrine of Loyola, right? So it's part of the three temples, the sanctuary of Aranzazu and the in Sumaraga, the La Antigua. But you have this shrine built around where Loyola was born in the little village of Loyola on the outskirts of Aspetia in central Guipúzcoa. The way that it's interesting too is like it's not you have to want to go there. The main highways in the area go around the mountain range, so it's kind of halfway between San Sebastian and to Bilbao, but it's down from the highway, so you have to take little roads to get into there. It's not the most accessible of places, but it is a well-traveled road because again, Loyola is a big saint. And the Urola Valley is beautiful. And in the late 1491, this was when they talk about like right before Spain took off, right? He's born in the last year of the Reconquista.
Yeah.
It's 1491. He's born there. The Casa Natal, the birth house, is you go in there. This is not a house. These are like 2 to 3 meter thick stone walls with cannons. This place is a fortress to basically protect the resources and the wealth that has been hoarded there by the Loyola family. He's the youngest of 13 children. His mother dies on the way out. And there's certain lore attached to that as well. And then there's also mystical lore attached to the fact that he was kind of adopted by the blacksmith who comes into play. So there's a lot of things that are interesting there with just as far as who raises him, where it happens, how it happens, and all these things, and all these things that are kind of viewed as signs later, right? That he is of mystical orientation. So you have this noble family. He's got this Inigo, who's named probably after a famous abbot nearby. The house names in that time period are the houses that you're born into or the village you're from. Oftentimes there's similar things here. But his mother died either on the way out as is popularized or at least right after, and maternal care falls to one of the Marias of the house, who I think Maria de Garin, who is the wife of the blacksmith. So he's believed to have been imbued with blacksmith weird mysteries at that point too, in the imagination. So he is the child of nobility, but is raised by the sorceress powers of the blacksmith's wife. So at some point, maybe 6, 7 years later, his oldest brother Martin is the heir to the estate and takes his new wife to live in the Castilla in the Loyola fortress, and so he returns back to the castle, and because as was common, and I don't think people modernly we can't. It's hard to understand what this means. When you are 13th in line for your family, you will be taken care of, but you will not be receiving anything.
Right.
You will have no individual possessions. They all are there at the mercy of the oldest child. And already you have like certain Napoleonic succession and things like what we call it that, but it's earlier than that, right? Of oldest child inherits no matter what is a very Basque cultural inheritance practice. But even within the larger laws, he was like, at least the oldest son is going to inherit everything. If you're 13th, you're fucked. Yeah. So usually by the 4th or 5th child, if you are the 3rd or 4th son, you understand that you are going to join the priesthood, and this is your only way to have any power in this lifetime. So, like many, this preamble is to be that the people around him recognized that he had a certain ability, but they had him tonsured at an early age, meaning he's bound for the cloth. He's meant to be a priest, and so there's a lot of romanticism about that, and he wants to be a knight, right? Really what he wants to be is a knight. He wants to go out in a pursuit of chivalry and these overly romanticized ideas about courtship, court life. He was also said to be incredibly vain, and although the paintings don't show it, maybe time is its own mystery here. He was said to be incredibly good looking, and so he was a bit of a player, being of this incredibly important family, but not necessarily, nothing's going to come of it because he can't inherit the same way. But he was destined. He had this deep desire to be famous, and he figured that if he didn't want to be a priest, he was going to have to be like El Cid, or or if you want to go off of narratives that are very to that area, right? The Song of Roland.
Yes. Yeah. All that like romantic lay and chivalry and stuff like that.
Which is a demon. There's a demon there we can investigate another time, but Fehebras comes from that same time period, right? Their Song of Roland directly responsible for that kind of promulgation of the enemy captain being a demon. So he joins the army, and that he is he even spurs a kind of Beyonce type of thing where he struts about with his cape flying open to reveal his incredibly tight-fitting hose.
There's a great take from the biographers I encountered, George Traub and Deborah Mooney, right, where they describe him as a fancy dresser, an expert dancer, a womanizer, sensitive to insult, and a rough punkish swordsman who used his privileged status to escape prosecution for violent crimes committed with his priest brother at carnival time. So there's like big poor vibes, right? Like
he's a punk.
But also like a rich kid punk.
I don't mean punk in the good way. I mean punk in I mean punk in the original sense. That he's a womanizer. He said, he values his physical form, and that he lives by the will of his balls and his dick,
Hmm.
basically.
Hmm.
That's part and parcel for the story too. It's important for what happens, right? So the he participates in many battles, but because of his privileged status, he's not really in the heat of battle.
Hmm.
However, there's a siege at Pamplona, which Pamplona is another one of the main Basque strongholds. Pamplona is in Nafarroa, so Nafarroa is a Basque-speaking province, but it's a little bit more Romanized, and they don't consider themselves to be like the lowly people of the upper provinces of Basque Country. Um, but at the battle in 1521, so he's roughly 30. There is a cannonball, which is this theme of cannonball comes up in a lot of Jesuit studies and in meditations of like,
Hmm.
what's your cannonball?
Hmm.
But the cannonball ricochets off of a nearby wall and it fractures his right leg. From the descriptions is that one leg is broken and the other one is smashed.
Oof.
And so there he goes under several surgical operations to repair the leg, and his bones are set and rebroken and set and rebroken. And his right leg is now shorter than the other. So he's walking with a permanent limp.
Hmm.
And his vanity does not like this. Like he is known, we have record that he threw temper tantrums over this, of like, how can I be expected to, serve the glory of God when I'm walking around like an animal? So he goes through it. His military career is obviously over, and he's going through it. He goes through a spiritual conversion during his recovery, and there is partially that he wanted to continue reading about chivalry and the things that kind of excited him from when he was younger and the things that got him into being a soldier as it was, but his house didn't have them, so he got to read like basically the Golden Legend and and stories about Jesus. So whether it was the Golden Legend or not, it's that it was specifically De Vita Christi, from Ludwig of Saxony, and just lives of the saint in general. He was a really big avid devotee or follower of Francis of Assisi,
Hmm.
and really looked to the ideas and the kind of giving up of the wealth, being a privileged boy as it is. So he gives into these things and he goes into a cave. And this is the you can go to the Manresa. The Manresa is the chapel in the cave of St Ignatius, where he not only practiced asceticism but further developed the spiritual exercises, of which the spiritual exercises are worth a read no matter anybody from any spiritual discipline. And they're specifically centered around Christ and Mary, but there's still something very interesting there. So before he goes into the cave, he goes off to Montserrat, which is there are many, many, many virgins he can go to, and Aranzazu is not far, but he decides to go to Montserrat. And he goes down. He examines his sins. He confesses, and he gives his clothes to the poor that he meets in their pilgrimages to Montserrat, and he hangs his weapons at the Virgin's altar, as he spends the night in the grove of Montserrat. And that's where he goes to Manresa, and that's the where he lived for a year in the cave, developing his spiritual exercises and kind of starting to understand what it was for him to be a convert in this way. That there was something sexy in the way that Francis did it, and I mean that not I mean that's my term, but that's what that's what he's well, it's sexy if you watch the Zeffirelli version, right? But
Something
brother,
very
son, sister,
appealing. Yeah, yeah.
brother, sun, sister, moon. Donovan does the soundtrack to it. I remember watching it in like seventh or eighth grade. But there's something appealing to him that he realizes that just as there was chivalry before, and he can't go into that military side. The next, he settles on the fact that the religious life is the best way for him to channel his desire to make a difference. We're going to put it that way so that we can kind of play on the humility that is obviously not there. Never considered a humble saint. So there was a series of things where he saw a serpent, and things that shone about, and it gave him much delight to look at the serpent, but he freaked out when the serpent disappeared. There are many interpretations according to that of what that might be. And a lot of it is the ancestral serpent lore that exists in the Pyrenees. But he came to interpret this vision as of the devil, and it kind of stole his way of like forging something new ahead for him as being who he is, from the family he is, from the region he's born, where he decides that he's going to march forward and go this way to Montserrat, to Manresa, and then immediately into a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, with the
Right,
idea
right.
of
He wants to go
moving.
to like full Jerusalem, right? Like
Yeah,
there's talk that he's like talking about plans to actually go and live there and like be at the epicenter. Which again, like Yeah, the idea of like dreaming big.
Yeah, he always whatever the biggest option is, and because that child of privilege is totally there still. So he's there about a month, and then he gets sent back by the Franciscans, who are like, hey, you're a little too much, right? So there's this idea, right? That you come into the alumbrados, which is here we get into some interesting like crossover of like the beginning of a conspiracy is going to sneak its way in here. But he
Mm,
does encounter a number of women who have been called before the Inquisition. When Inigo was practicing on this, preaching on the street, one falls into ecstatic trance or ecstatic state. And this is not uncommon for the Mediterranean. So it's one of those things that going back, and it's important to understand these things in context, that
yeah.
like ecstasy and understand having visions, we're not fully, people have not fully understood the transition. It's been about 300 years, but this idea that you're automatically going to be charged with witchcraft and the Inquisition is going to come get you is not really bent into that. We haven't even gotten into the full weight of the auto de fe that did most of the damage in Spain in the 1600s,
Mm.
but late 1500s, early 1600s, and we haven't gotten to like the New World Inquisitions yet. But they would roll around on the ground, and they're just suffering a divine madness at his preaching, and there's this idea here that he is not sanctioned because he has no degree. So I love this idea that it's like the academics looking at someone like, what are you, an independent scholar? No.
Yeah, also like they're blowing up his spot, right? Like,
Yeah, exactly.
like,
So
oh, we
he's
can't go to the authorities about these visions because I'm not legally allowed necessarily, or like ecclesiastically allowed to be even like prompting them.
Yeah, exactly. So, but again, child of privilege, already
Mm,
clergy in the family. Family has donated a lot to the cause, as it were. And
right.
so, he changed his names to Ignatius. And there's a lot of speculation around this that he's trying to become more Europeanized and whatever. Or it's just that maybe he got tired of hearing his name butchered,
Right.
is another biographer's perspective. And I do think that that's there. So he becomes Ignatius Loyola. And he moves to France. He goes to Paris. He studies at several colleges, including the University of Paris, and
Yeah, he goes
there's a
back to
lot.
school late, right? It's like he's like
Yeah,
33, which is pretty awesome.
which is interesting too, because you also have his 33 thing is that you can join the Jesuits until you're 33.
Ah,
You have until your 33rd birthday. By 33, you have to have had the desire to actually enter, which I always find fascinating too, because up until I was 33, I had that thing where you're like, do I just want to go join the Jesuits? Um, once you're aware of the option. But so there, you have Protestantism, which is now on the rise. It's happening. It's confusing people, but it's happening. So you also have this immediate band of people who come from similar backgrounds, and you have Francis Xavier and Peter Faber are both his like earliest best friends, and those six friends that he makes, Alfonso Samaron, Diego Lañez, Nicholas Bobadilla. And then there's Simão Rodriguez, and then you have Francis Xavier, who's also Basque, and so that's their bond there. And Peter Faber. Those six people become the first of the Order of Society of Jesus of the Jesuits. So
and that's 1539, and I think I was reading that like they set it up then, and then it's approved by the Pope or someone. Like it's the rubber stamp goes on it the next year.
yeah. So 1534, I think, is when he celebrated the first chapel at Montmartre, and then he goes to Rome. It does get rubber stamped, like you said. 1539 forms the official society. So by 1540, there are 7 members of the Society of Jesus. The difference here of what stands out for the Society of Jesus is, okay, you have the conversion experience, the soldier, and all these things. The fact that they not only swear the typical 3 vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the Jesuits are invited to take a 4th vow, which is obedience to the Pope. So this vow means that and this was part of his was that he knew somehow the vision was that if by offering their obedience to the Pope, they would become the Pope's people.
Right.
That they would rise above the ranks very quickly, which is exactly what happened. So the vow meant the Jesuits are ready to accept whatever mission the Pope requires. They become, in essence, a revised like Knights Templar of the Pope without the explicit military connotation. And so the Pope, who is existing in a time where the kingdoms of the Pope have been broken up. So the Pope has less power, but is still trying to hold on to power. And this sets the stage for what happens, because we can talk about spiritual exercises in a minute, but the fact that the Jesuits have been kicked out of every major European country at one point, um, because of their machinations of what the papal agenda is.
Mm,
So when Protestants accuse people of being papists, the Jesuits are the quintessential papists because they're
right.
like, we will execute the Pope's special plan for the world.
Yeah.
Special plan. Um, so I think there's wonderful cause for scrutiny and weirdness there. The Jesuits are absolutely instrumental in the conversion of the New World. They are ruthless about it. They attack things intellectually. They were the ones that said, you know what, if you can't beat them, join them and then beat them after you know how to beat them better. That was my summary, not something that they actually said. Um, but the idea that they could go in and they would say, no, teach us about your ways. Teach us your language, to initiate us into your mystery cults. And then they could go in and subvert it from the inside. So it was kind of they were part of the promulgators of the kill the Indian, love, love the, the person that's left, whatever you
Mm.
call that. There's, my God, my brain turns off and I'm like, I know there's something there. That phrase means something in the kind of conversion factors, but they're
The
pretty.
language is a big part of that, right? Like they're some of the ones that are like learning the language and then saying, ah, now we understand what you think about this like deity or theological
Yes,
concept. Isn't that really, wouldn't you say?
yes.
Yeah, Jeebus.
It's like then you get like like as of 10 years ago at least, I remember reading this big article about like the biggest Zen master who's not native to the tradition is a Jesuit priest.
Hmm.
Like the Jesuits would go in. They're the scientific like anthropologists and sociologists that go in, and it plays into that joke, which I'm sure I've told on this show before, of like the light goes out and there's a Dominican, there's a Franciscan, and there's a Jesuit, sometimes more, Benedictine, whatever it is, and it just is telling you what how each person thinks about their relationship with God, but like that the Franciscan is like, we let us take a minute to commune with our mother, the darkness from which we are all born, and that to appreciate God's light more. And the Dominican is like, I deserve this. And the Benedictine is like, let us go to work to find firewood in the dark so that we might make new fire to be seen, to see the light of God. I really kind of skimmed over the Dominicans there as being we deserve this, but that's what and the Jesuits meanwhile have gone and changed the fuse and the lights come back on. Um, that there's always been this like practicality of like why are we being overly mystical? That's something for each individual to pursue, but
Mm,
the Jesuits themselves don't waste time on the navel gazing when there's work to be done that can be explained through other means. So the Jesuits were famous for like introducing the like, this isn't an exorcism that's needed, this is counseling that's needed, this is therapy that's needed, this is medication that's needed. So it became this reputation even amongst the Catholics of being like the more scientific of the orders, and the ones that also like demystified things and made things a little bit less fun. They were like the Protestants among the Catholics in that way. But also the spiritual exercises themselves have so much interesting meat to them. And the way that they're set up, right, is that are usually done like over a month period of 31 days where you are participating in every part of your day is scripted by these exercises. But then some part of it also is that you are seeing so like the four focuses are purpose in life, the human person, freedom, and ethics, right? Like so they're trying to already like get into how do you do this? Like, what is an examine, for instance, of like giving thanksgiving, beginning giving thanks to God, asking for the Spirit, like I want to look at the moments of the day when I did not act so well. Then you review and recognize failures. Then you ask for forgiveness and healings, and then you pray about a better agenda for the next day. So,
mm,
like this daily examine, for instance, was ushering people to basically look at the day and say, where did you fuck up, and how can you do better tomorrow?
yeah.
Um, and what's interesting is that a lot of modern business practice, I'm told or some of business practice of like when you do the review at the end of the day of like what is it that you still have left to do was actually suggested by people as to from the spiritual exercises of Loyola
Huh.
of like it's an effective way of like okay, this is what you weren't able to accomplish today and this is where you could have done better. How can you change that for tomorrow? Otherwise there's no
Right.
point in about it. So it was a way of divesting yourself of anxiety about tomorrow, which is totally a Catholic thing, right? Deliver us, Lord, from all anxiety, which I
Yeah.
think they mean about the coming of Christ. But, it's really interesting that you're going to have Catholics talk about like praying for relief from anxiety when we're like the most anxious people I know. Um, but this idea of how do you prepare for the next day and how do you actually do it well is fascinating to me. So, Ignatius Loyola's legacy has the spiritual exercises, prayer and contemplation, the daily examine, and discernment as its four pillars.
Mm.
And so there's a lot there. It's a fascinating order. I think there's a lot of amazing conspiracy theory shit you can go into in the modern occult world as well as the ancient, or not ancient, but in the early modern,
Mm.
because they're terrified of what the Jesuits are doing as the messengers of the Pope.
Mm.
Like and from there, yeah, I think did I miss it? I was like, you were like, yeah, you go ahead and go off on it, Loyola. I was like, great, I'm gonna do that. Here we go. I think I just did that.
Yeah, no, that was great. Yeah. That was great. Yeah, this idea of the spiritual exercises having this simple contemplation around like um visualizing yourself like at the scenes of gospel stories as well.
Yes.
Is
Yeah.
something I've come across a couple times that you've raised before now, right? Like visualizing the crib at the nativity and that kind of thing. So there's a
Yeah.
sense of organizing your day, and also like the aspect of like mythic time, right? That like this is not just a thing that happened in the past that we can cite precedents and argue legalistically over. There's also a sense of like feeling the mythic weight of these actions in the present.
Yeah, there is this the habit of prayer and meditation itself, it naturally includes references to the scripture that we know, but also a scripture that is invited to be lived with in context with your life. That there
Mm.
two things are happening, overlap, and that even on some level, I think many orders do this. Like certainly it's invited to do this when you're talking about a liturgical wheel of celebration of story whereby you're going through all of the Psalms in a week, or all of the scripture over the course of a year through the calendar of Jesus's birth and life and death and resurrection and teaching and all these things that allows for understanding of what that may be in your own life. And certainly we see that of like, even in the simplicity of calling someone a Judas, which is where he went for the main character role real quick. But at the same time, like there's something interesting to understanding and allowing that the scripture isn't static and dead, and that
Mm.
it is something that is meant to be a living tradition, and you are meant to be living it, is very Loyolan, is very Jesuit. Um,
Yeah. I was looking at some of the history of his like canonization, so which seems to happen in 1622, although he is beatified in 1609. But in 1922, Pope Pius XI declares him a patron saint of spiritual retreats, of like all spiritual retreats, it seems.
yeah, I mean he did. He certainly did. I mean he's considered the patron saint of the Enlightenment, which is
Mm.
incredibly wonderfully problematic. Um,
I love
um,
I love that meme of like it's like someone giving someone a medal, but they're the same person. They're both labeled the Enlightenment, and the medal is labeled the label of the Enlightenment.
oh
Like the
God,
ultimate kind of patting itself on the back kind of thing.
yeah. I mean, and ultimately, because there's so much suppression in the Society of Jesus, like it can make it seem like it's a lot of theological controversy when really it's mostly political and economic bullshit.
Right.
Don't interfere with my land. Don't interfere with my riches coming in from another country. And like you're trying to secure the Pope's wealth, I'm trying to secure my wealth. That's
Mm.
really what it came down to, a lot of it. But it makes it seem like they're like finding art, like there's these myths that the Jesuits are finding artifacts in the New World that are giving them access to power. And this is like long before things like Assassin's Creed proposed the same things, right?
Well, they're building on a thing, right? Like the like history, or maybe even like the historiography of um occultism as an ism is partly like from the 19th and definitely the 20th century, is a study of not just ideas but of the people and the sodalities and the secret societies that supposedly promulgated those ideas. And so they are like that brand of occultism is prefigured to look for like conspiracy basically, and that like, oh, it's hidden, that's therefore part of it. And that's not to say they're all, that it was all chart bruiting bizarre ideas, but like again looking at like Bob Wilson's distinction between conspiracism and conspiracy theory, right, actually studying what people have been saying about this stuff. But they're still prefigured to be looking for um, the not just the myths of artifacts or of like secrets or of like the black masses or what have you, but like they're because they're trying to chart like who's a Rosicrucian, what does that even mean, what's the alombrados, like it's kind of baked into their lens, so to speak, so it's not surprising.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too with the Society of Jesus too, because there is so much emphasis on the personal work is really ascribed. Like you must do these meditations. There ends up being this way where like it's also an incredibly or an order known for its camaraderie. Because they think differently than other orders. So, and I also find that even evident, it's fascinating that 1622, when he's canonized, Francis Xavier is canonized the same day.
Ah.
Gregory doesn't let him come in alone. Like, if I'm going to say the Society of Jesus is the founder is holy, let's bring in his brother Basque there.
Right.
It was with him all along. The big thing too is like if the balance of education and soldiering and retreats and the Jesuits themselves, there's the Socipe prayer, Socipe, so I'm Italian probably, and I'm not good at this language, but take Lord and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will, all I have and call my own. You have given all to me, to you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your loving and grace. That is enough for me. Is pretty much where he goes with it, and the idea that like being a child of privilege means nothing if he can't receive privilege as a natural flowing grace from
Right.
God, and that's kind of where he's at. So a prick of a man apparently, and very vain, a womanizer who then can't stand that he walks with a limp. And has a series of revelations and kind of forms an integral society that's still around and thriving. They are perhaps more than any other order fans of education, and that you read everything and you make
Yeah.
a decision later under good counsel about how to proceed forward. But that, like, if there's ever one religious group that is not a book burner, it's these.
Yeah. I wonder if I mean, that's almost certainly where, like, in sort of, modern popular hagiography, he's regarded as a patron of librarians specifically, right, as well.
Yeah. So there we have some Ignatius Loyola and serpent visions and Mary and Montserrat and all these things going on. Our demon of the day is Haristum. So
So from a patron of books to a spirit of them, the other people of the book.
yeah.
Yeah. So Haristum's
That was a great pause. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Haristum. Yes.
Yeah, it's a Verum spirit. We're back to some good Verum business. He's a spirit is one of the eight under Hale and Sergalaf, which therefore puts them under Astaroth, if we're going by that kind of line model through the ministrations of Neberos. So Haristum's role is there isn't a lot of like variation. There's some like different kinds of turns of phrase for it, going from most recent to least. In Jake's True Grimoire, his office is that he can cause anyone to pass through fire without being touched by it. I think Alabec that Joe Peterson puts out as Grimorium Verum has Haristum gives one the power to pass among flames without burning. So that's a little more specific than not being touched, I guess. And then in some of the other Italian ones that are kicking around, and some of the French ones as well, I think, like Bestetti and Musi, it's specifically that he gives you the power to walk on burning coals, such that the flames will neither burn nor cause pain. So we have that burning coals, which is interesting in terms of the counterparting to Brasa. We'll get into in a minute. So there's not a lot on them beyond that in the corpus. The eight are some of the least likely to have seals. They do have them. If we go back to like Welcome 983, L'Art Magique, but they're often not included, and they're often like a kind of little. They're a second line off from the main kind of 3 into 6 into 18 of the core Verum spirits. And I don't think there are any supernatural secrets or like spells dedicated to working with them, as we get with other spirits, where not only is this their office, is this their sigil, is this the way that you run the full pact protocol to make a deal with them and to be on their work gang, and then what do you do with them, right? The applied conjurations, as the Science of Nigorazzi puts it. But there is a mention, almost as an aside, in Jake's Elelegat pamphlet, when he's talking about consecration, which in the GV at least is always asperging and fumigating, and the horizon of the instruments, and probably the 7 penitential psalms if you're feeling fancy, and some things have other particular consecratory horizons for them as well. But again, one of the things I love about the horizon of the instruments is it says, any and all things that are in front of me, where Jake shows like a little like extra part of his like beyond the books practice, which I think is the thing I wanted to talk about today, because it's kind of partly he's talking about it because it's an answer to the way that consecration can have some approaches to it, especially a more ceremonial approach, can have a kind of bootstrapping problem. Like, how do you pull yourself up by the bootstraps of consecrating tool consecrations, right? How do you consecrate the tool that you use to consecrate, which are the aspergillus and the sprinkler, like the basin of water and the thing that you flip the water around with, and the censer and its coals and its incense. This is sometimes problematized in some, or there are often solutions posited in like branches of the Golden Dawn that are like, how do you consecrate the wand when you need the cup, and how do you consecrate the cup when you need the wand? Again, a bunch of Golden Dawn people are probably like, well, we know how. There's an order to it. Exactly. So with Verum, at least, it's that you start with the water itself, right? You bless the water, and then you sprinkle that over the asperger and the sprinkler, and then you fumigate it. And in fumigating, that involves also beforehand washing the censer, and then a blessing of the incense itself. And the incense is that official blend of aloes wood, frankincense, and mace. But Jake gives a little prayer for what you're doing when you are consecrating the perfume that's more tied into like an actual Verum practice, and not just appealing to these spirits to do stuff or to be in your gang, but also working with them to do the thing you're working on, which is an appeal to Haristum, right? The blessing of the incense he gives is fiery spirit Haristum, and thou wise Herimale, who's one of the main spirits in Verum for herbs, right? So you've got the coals of the censer and the incense that you put on it, right? Bless the creature of this perfume, that it be a remedy for the human race and a remedy for our souls and bodies, that all creatures breathing this fumigation have wealth of their bodies and souls by the power of the lords of the aeons. And he then also, gives some of his formulae, partly derived from kind of PGM type stuff, to Titan and Nuit and Eopan. So like his brand of like of Thelema is coming in as well, and refers to the great diamonds, and also a wise and powerful spirits, Herimale and Haristum, that you give virtue, so this creature may gain a shape, right? So Haristum isn't officially listed as the official spirit of the censer in the same way, or not like Frimost and Klepoth's sigils are found on the Elder and Hazel wands, respectively, or Bechaud's on the killing knife, or Guland and Sergat's on the liming pot, which again is one of the things that I love about like more modern iterations of Verum, is that you are not just using the tools to point at spirits. There's a sense that they co-own them with you, that you are, when picking up those wands, like kind of working hand in hand with these spirits. So again, not just for an operation, like making it rain with Bechaud, who rules the weather as well as the winds, but just to actually do the GV. And this kind of raises a thing that I've been looking into of late, which is actually like about that whole put the spirit sigils on the tools. Because I love it for a lot of reasons. I've expounded on why I like it on this very podcast. But in looking at earlier manuscripts of Verum, it is, shall we say, a development. So the Alabec manuscript doesn't give the tool sigils, doesn't give any of them. It doesn't have them. It doesn't seem to have included what you put on the tools, but it does say you have to put something on them. It's like with this figure, but the figure isn't included. And so by the time you've got Blochiel, the bookmaker and seller, doing their version, they use the spirit sigils that they have. And so JHP, shout out Joe Peterson, says that they substitute the characters of the spirits for those. And he says that he believes these innovations were done to avoid the appearance of this, that this text is basically an edition of the clavicular, which Blochiel also sold, right? And he points out that there are correct characters again in Welcome 983, and that those are, funnily enough, consistent with the clavicular and the heptameron. So the earlier versions of Verum are more consistent and do use these sigils that look like the Key of Solomon type sigils. They're not spirit sigils. Well, they're not a single like character of a spirit that we would call the sigil of a spirit. They're more like characters, right? They're more like kind of letters and stuff. So we could look at this and say, oh, it was a marketing scheme. That's the only reason the sigils of the spirits turn up on these things, right? It's a way of this bookseller making people need to buy more books. And sure, we could go back to what sigils should be on the tools from L'Art Magique. And that's a reasonable approach. But I also like the idea of looking at this as a development, right? That it's something that happens, and we can also work with that, right? I mean, I don't think it's too much speculation to point out that who knows where Blochiel gets the inspiration to add those particular spirit sigils in the first place and why he chose those particular ones. I think there's still room to consider the influence and the desires of the spirits themselves, which is a big part of Verum. It says, these are the protocols that the spirits have not, if not like explicitly given, that they've agreed to, right? That we all agree that these are the protocols that work. That's why you do them. And I think by embracing this development, it gives us options to find ways to work more closely with the spirits, hand in hand to do the work and to learn by doing. So Jake doesn't explicitly say engrave the sigil of Haristum on your censer, but I see no reason not to, right? And what I like about that, like just to kind of reiterate from some tangents there, is looking at the offices and seeing how they can help us, not just in a particular operation, but how we operate in general, right? It makes sense that a spirit that makes sure that you don't get hurt by burning coals is present and prayed to when you are literally working with burning coals, right? Yeah. Developing that reputation, that relationship by working together and turning.
No, I think it's a lovely part for it, especially for a book like this specific grimoire that it is, where it is, being described as the more pagan of the grimoires, in the sense that these spirits are not demons by their nature. They are demons by a church letter, but there's something else going on here. Yeah. Within the context of the book. Doesn't mean maybe we're wrong. Maybe they're even more demonic than everything else, and that's the punchline. You got me, gal. But I think there's something to this also, which we see as modeled by geomancy outside of just the Golden Dawn era, trying to resurrect it. See it more in the current resurrection of geomancy, partially because of you and Sam and others, where a figure can contain in its essence not just the divination message, but a hope for what that figure represents. So the figures themselves, or else why would we see these charts of putting them into sigils, or what you talked about before of conjunctio being a valid sigil to put on anything where you want something to manifest.
Where you want it to land. It's the cross.
Yeah, exactly. The two, in the case of emergency. So I think that there's something in that logic too, with the inscribing of Haristum here of coals going either way, but why not be on the better side of coals?
Yeah.
Or even to remind yourself that what you are doing visually, to have that reminder and that flag that what you are doing is by its nature sacred, a sacred act the minute you call attention to it, not because of certain words, not because of, for me, in the larger performance of things, right? That avoiding the need where you have to say the words just so, but to understand that the intent and the attention that you bring is as much an ingredient as having the exact shade of blue that is being argued about. So I find that
that it's not just a collecting spirits, right? Which one should I work with? Which one should I collect next? It's that in developing this relationship with this spirit, you're fumigating everything, right? Like it helps us work with any and all of the spirits in our sodality.
Similar to the discussion around Skirlin in with on our earlier episode this year, of just like there are certain spirits that you will not meet in the everyday, and that's good. That there are times where you don't necessarily want to come across a certain spirit in the everyday of life every day. When they appear, you need them to mean what they are saying or what they are. But there are other spirits that when you talk about it, of like, what is the job of a knife? It is to cut. That what is the job of a mirror? It is to reflect. And that these powers of reflection and cutting, if they are in spirit form, or there are spirits that are tied to those mysteries, to those arcana, like it is better to understand them as part of our daily life, so that we can, in essence, invoke the reflection and invoke the cutting in a meaningful manner, whereby we are not disastrously thrown apart when we do have reflection thrust upon us or cutting thrown upon us. So that's a larger discussion, but
inoculation. I think that's super important. And it's not making yourself so insensate that you are immune to fire in the sense of not feeling anything, and then needing to work out how to walk without legs. It's that you are it's an increased sensitivity that allows you to navigate those things. And engagement with the world.
Interestingly, that by engaging with these sigils as one thing of representing that spirit and that mystery, the more even the seemingly most banal application of that sigil as to engrave it upon a spoon, because that spoon touches burning coals, can invite a complete watering down, or can invite a complete like winding up, I guess. And I don't mean that necessarily in the dance term, but it will come into temperance, because water to wine is important there. But so I think that practical side of it is far more interesting to me, and I think from what I've seen has more of an effect upon the magician's ideas about how these spirits interact in our lives as being something more than just a Sunday Christian in goetic robes. That these demons are, once you have called them to awareness to those demons, to those spirits in your daily life, and they should be appearing in your daily life. They should be interacted with in your daily life. Again, not all of them on a daily basis or on a minute by minute, but there are certain ones that are perhaps meant to be there at all times. The whole point of a familiar is that you have made of a demon or a spirit a familiar, something that is like family, that is around you all the time, that is able to advise, to insert itself, to warn, to educate, so
that you go to for anything, what you do when you don't know what to do.
Yes. I like okay, so the corresponding issue, which I know you've read about as much as I have, the Brasa is an interesting one. It's very easy to pontificate on and make all these metaphysical things on, because of the heat element, because it's the burning coal, the ember, as it were, that glow that happens on a coal, that red silver glow that oversweeps charcoal. There is a call to him being perhaps more jinn-like. In some of the modern divisions of how people talk, Ingrid's podcast on Kuziada had a wonderful episode. Wish I could remember his name. I might find it shortly by means of multitasking. But the division of understanding at least Quimbanda's larger kind of three spheres of influence here, being like Mosuro Mim, and the kind of aerial nature of spirits, the kind of jinn-like inheritance of much of what was coming in.
Mm.
You have a very would be called Nago, and is Nago is a term, yes, can mean Yoruba, but also tends to mean African, especially in Brazilian parlance. So it's not always just Yoruba, but a reference to the Central African and West African peoples that were brought over and their ways of doing things. But Nago in this case was about earth and blood and substance that was held down, and a very earthy shrine,
Mm.
of which blood and pact and tree were involved. Um, that is different from the aerial nature of Jinn, which might be attached to a gem or a small charm that could be pinned down, and that it could come into that or live in that. The kind of one lamp is a small lamp is the Jinn's hiding place, as opposed to this shrine that is horns and blood and nails and dirt and animal parts and all these things that are fed, which is
Yeah.
very knuckle. And then very Malay, which is the memory of dead kings, the cult of dead high personalities, dead high ranking things that
Mm.
could then be called upon to command things. And you see, I mean, he's looking at a kind of Quimbanda inheritance, and I think there's something interesting to consider with that in a European context too. Just similar things of the memory of royal ancestry or the memory of divine blood that we go to with, like, I am so and so, who is then ultimately a child of Adam and therefore a son of God, who is therefore able to command you, demon, because I have God's breath in me.
Yeah,
Um,
how many of the denigromancer expressed explicitly, but how many of the those brand of like 16th century grimoires, the consecrating of the tools, like with denigromancer especially, it mirrors old coronation rites. In some cases, you're meant to have a priest who gives you the crown that you're wearing and gives you the sword that you have to do this stuff. Like you are assuming a royal authority, not just by claiming to be Solomon, but like working off a basis of other ways of consecrating, of being anointed, and therefore like able to assume an authority by dead kings. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So it was Douglas Caino,
Mm.
um, who is Tatenganga Selawapansu of the Govaja Chiriri, was interviewed by Ingrid on the Encruzilhada podcast. La, 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 la. I had a date there, but approximately 11 weeks ago. There we go, because that's how Instagram works. Thank you, Instagram.
Mhm.
You're very helpful. But if you don't know about auto translate on especially live things, it's really helpful in YouTube that you can set auto caption and then you can do auto translate based on that. So if you're not a Lusophone and you want to capture, there's a lot of amazing podcasts on Quimbanda and different religious group scenes that are in Brazil or anywhere. Keep in mind that YouTube has a lot of tools to live translate for you, and that is very helpful. It won't be sacrosanct. It won't be like you won't be able to quote it in a paper because you got to get the real translation, but it does make it possible for you to engage with a lot of things. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in his descriptions and breakdowns of things, it's on Quimbanda Musuramin, on that specific episode of Encruzilhada with Ingrid and the Kabbalah Mulembo people. Anyway, okay, so we have this division of aerial, very earthy, and very royal commanding, which we still see. That's the Malay influence. So we still see those kind of things, right, in how Quimbanda governs itself. But with Brasa is to be more aerial, and part of this is just this nature of fire to be transient. The fact that Brasa is not the flame, but the ember,
Yeah.
is the burning coal, which is also interesting because that's one of the ways of testing spirits when they're down, is through the trial of the burning akara, right? So you might have to pull something out of oil, or you might have to put something on fire into your mouth. And so there's this kind of like Brasa, like, must invoke everyone, or everyone must invoke Brasa's safety at some point. But there's anything that has this kind of he has a much more demonic air about him. It is said, I have seen the very light to the very like snarly manifestations of him.
Mm.
I don't know if I've seen him come down in the States. I've seen him in Brazil a couple of times now. Sigatana a light gives him to Dwaska, gives a similar nature to Dwaska basis because of this kind of ambivalent. Ambivalent's an interesting term.
Mm.
I do think that Brasa tends to have no he is headless in the truest sense of, like, there's nothing guiding him unless you guide him.
Mm.
Like, you must be able to command if you're going to work with certain spirits, and those of coal and fire, of shadow and flame. Grab that Balrog by the horns
Yeah.
and figure it out. But I think that there is a reputation for Brasa having more relationship with, like, the hierarchies of Western demonology and things
Mm.
like this. Tied to the mythic dragon Eshu. which is, always hush hush. Um, but more importantly, I think we run into Brasa in the way that he is portrayed through his Mirim form, which is Brasinha. And Brasinha is, if anybody who is not familiar with Quimbanda, if you have seen this baby that is doing basically the Aleister Crowley hand salute, with a giant Star of David bling around his neck and his little belly sticking out. This is Brasinha.
The devil baby.
Little devil baby, little devil coal baby, which is they say is like the little sparks that fly off of a flame and like land on you and burn you for like 2 seconds, then they're gone. This is Brasinha. It's not the full coal. It's the like, oh, you little bitch, ow. So it's that. And anybody working with charcoal, especially self-igniting charcoal, is very familiar with these little sparks, right? The little sulfur that takes your breath away for just a half second. A little bitchy little firefly that lands on you and burns you for half a second. There's no permanent mark, but sure is kind of a pain in the ass. It's just very just Eshu, right? The argument you survive, the thing that you survive. And Brasinha here, I think it's interesting because it brings up the Minim form. So yes, there's burning coals and gunpowder and snakes and salamanders and hawks and blah blah blah. That is Eshu Brasa. The heat of the pepper itself as a metaphor for fire and for inner fire. But really, we see the Brasinha form is also to understand that every Eshu, every demon in Quimbanda can manifest itself as in a childlike form. And this form they're dangerous, of course, because they are more iterative, they are more reiterative, I suppose, repetitive, more hyper-focused on some of their tasks. And therefore, while their spiritual weight is less sometimes, their repetition can make them even more difficult to deal with. So Minim brings out the notion of child spirits and what that is. Minim is its own Eshu, but therefore blends with every other Eshu, where to the point where Minim and Menina become like their own kingdom, right? Where they can appear as any of the other Eshus and Pombagiras, or that any of the other Eshus and Pombagiras have a Minim or Menina form. And so I think that's just its own interesting side to consider, and what it means to be a child spirit that is not evolving into an adult form. What is the stasis? What is the stagnancy that is there? And I think that's an interesting connection to the figure of the day and to Ohani, as an Odu, which on some level is the dam that stops the waters from flowing. And possession is born in Ohani. For instance, and like possession is this place where, ironically, it grants access to the body of the person, but also it reifies the current vision of what the spirit is in the body of a practitioner. But that doesn't mean that that's what the spirit is, or that that's where the practitioner is. It is just a moment of overlap in that time. So similarly, how was just talking about how in practice, some of us are members of multiple traditions, and we both might serve the dead, and that the opaiku of Lukumi, the staff that is used to call the dead, grants access to a space where offerings may be placed for the dead. It is one of these things that is used to open up that Vesica Pisces of overlap that we depend upon, and that in our lineage of Quimbanda, that there are similar tools for that, where you are opening up a space whereby offerings can be placed, and there's an intersection between the world of the living and the world of the dead, whereby offerings may be placed. It does not mean that those technologies are equal or the same, or can even be combined well, but they operate in similar ways. And it's an interesting thing because, again, this discussion we've had many times, and is always going to be a criticism of those of us who practice many things, just like those of us who are children of many cultures. There comes a point where you have to both keep everything incredibly detailed and separate, but also understand that you yourself are the one that you're going to have to understand them as a comprehensive whole for you to be able to be healthy. That does not necessarily mean that you practice them at the same time, nor water them down, or do any of these things that would then change the practice from its standard. But those changes are what do happen over time anyway. Those appropriations and syncretisms and understandings of what needs to be kept to keep something true for a group or populace. So I'm always curious in the academic way of like, what are these overlaps and what are these zones of intersection, and how do they propose further ritual, further means, further cultural markers, further magical ritual markers moving forward. But there's no specific answer of what it can be, because you're going to run across the must keep it separate, and you're also going to run across the like, but they're all the same thing in the end. and both are true, and
Mm.
both are not true. So it's a not all the way. It's not all the way down. Um,
Mhm.
Tied
Mhm.
in a fantastical macrame of trying to fucking understand what it is that we do. Um,
Right, right, right.
so
And what frictions are born by that crossroads that we aren't just at, but that like the crossroads of our practices, like the crossroads that are us.
yeah, and the fact
Mm.
that like language itself does not. Ritual is a language that
Mm.
utilizes spoken language, visual language, movement, color, rhythm, smells, all these different other languages at its disposal. But especially when we're limited to just written or auditory language to describe something, we will always fall short. And we could pick apart our own narratives of these things in an hour and find fault with half the things we've just said. So it's I especially find it easy as to why anybody could find fault with what I'm saying right now. Because if I can tear it apart in a half hour and tell you the other side of it, then you certainly should be able to. Um, and but that's also what the confines of our inculcated tongues of what they are.
Yeah.
I wonder about that, like on a complete other tangent, right? And Brasa being evocatory of the dragon, of the great beast, and
Mm.
its 7 heads and 10 horns, and the tongues that speak all at once. Like
Mm.
it would take me 7 heads in order to fully articulate something to satisfaction, and yet I don't have that time or that gift yet. You know, I'm working with the 2 horns I have. God damn it. So yeah, I think there's something really interesting in this mixture of Brasinha, his relationship to Brasa, this relationship to what is the demonic Haristum, that is also just the pragmatism of the fire that allows us to use heat to fumigate, to suffumigate,
Mm.
to it's funny that whole delineation itself, right? I'm always going to say fumigate, but even that implies more like what you do with tents and termites. Suffumigate, to sense, to sign, or to saying, to smudge, to any of these words and all of their wonderful problematic repercussions.
Mm.
Um, but to burn a bunch of shit on a bunch of other shit so that your whole house smells like the shit that you're trying not to set to flame too quickly.
Yeah.
Um, there is a slow torture in this, and that I think even bringing back the memory of like Olympian sacrifice. It's been great talking to a couple people about the accuracy and the kind of huge very few sources that agree upon the nature of Olympic Catonic sacrifice,
Mm.
and that we don't have as much evidence as we would like to say that that's a universal thing.
Mm.
But the idea that the Olympian sacrifice, or like even mountain gods in Canaan, that the burnt offering, the smell of the burning flesh, is to not go too quickly. You want it to somewhat at least arise up so that the gods of the heavens can smell what has been done,
Yeah.
and so you don't want it to be consumed to flame too quickly, which
Mm.
brings on the nature of human barbecue in the Inquisition
Mm.
and the Reformation, and notions of perhaps of bundles of sticks of 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 faggotry in that way being used
Mm.
to keep the flames hot so that the person burns faster. But does that mean God smells them less? I don't know. Uh,
Mm.
anyway, so Eshu Brasa Haristum, I think there's something in there in the sense of that overlap or that stagnation from Brasinha to Brasa that can be explored in maybe in our figure of Fortuna Major.
Yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. I like that a lot. I like that a lot. There's definitely a sense with Fortuna Major that it also feels apt to bring up when we're talking about like what does the I mentioned that like early Inigo feels very like poor, like the
Uh-huh.
young kids itching to run off to the glory of war. And I think Fortuna Major is like if we're going to chart the development from like Pur is also kind of sparky and like the beginnings of fire, and Fortuna Major is like a furnace, is like a tended fire, is a not even tended, is a contained fire, is the actual burn. Like Fortuna Major has a lot of associations with like being a captain or being a good general, someone that's actually seen war and has been battered by it and is continuing to trudge on. There's a lot of like They're a good defender rather than someone that's like spoiling for a fight. It's often framed in terms of their like honorable conduct, steadfastness, fidelity. What's the phrase? Loyalty with force, and that can look very, very kind of lawful good, very kind of paladin. Not the romantic take on it, but like the battered knight who is like a little like not quite the drunkenness of Falstaff, but definitely the like war is not war is not pretty. Like that kind of stuff is definitely there, along with this like fundamental choleric nature. But I think the part of the stagnation is really fascinating to get into because for me, I see a lot of Fortuna Major's spirits as, yes, these kind of like knights in battered armor, but there is a consistent theme throughout the delineations, which is around, it's generally a very favorable figure. Generally, yes, you will succeed, the greater fortune, but it's also the hard won fortune. It's that like the lasting success, the grounded good that outlives you is a struggle. It's a hard won fortune. It's a way in which it can feel like, you know, two steps forward, one step back. And there's more a point here what I'm trying to get at around specifically, well, two things: getting locked in the struggle that you know as opposed to the struggle you don't. The biggest problems of Fortuna Major are often tendencies towards work-life imbalance, like outright workaholism, unceasing labor, compulsive acts of service, putting others first to your eventual detriment, or deriving self-worth solely from the never-ending work that's ahead of you, that you've dug yourself into, and that you damn it, I'm just going to grit my teeth and keep at it. There's a lot of self-sovereignty, but there's also a lot of like, I will do what I know to, like, I will do what I know. The other part that again gets referenced in a lot of the delineations is that it's a great figure for most things. Yes, you will succeed. Yes, it's going to be hard work. Yes, there's you know, no good deed goes unpunished. Doing the right thing is not always easy. There's that element to it. But there's also this sense Hayden talks about where he says it's good in any question you can demand, but in heavy and sad things where it signifieth melancholiness. And there's this sense of Fortuna Major's heavy plate mail is also a potential barrier shielding its heart. And that these watertight regimes of enduring labor, yes, can achieve great triumphs against the difficulties of the world. But they can also kind of incubate particular susceptibilities of being wounded by the battles within, right? There's a real sense of like heavy is the heart that wears the breastplate in Fortuna Major. And that sense of like the road that they can see and that they know about, the difficulties that they're aware of are just the difficulties they are. And I will power through. But the idea of doing something different or approaching in a new way or growing out of the old armor is tough for Fortuna Major and the people that are very marked by it.
Right. So if we're looking at Fortuna Major or any of the homoforms, I don't know what to call them.
Morphologically similar.
Yeah, that doesn't flow off the tongue the same way. Okay, we're looking at 2211, right?
Yeah. Active, earth, and water. Yeah, and if we're going to go by active and passive or spreading out or not cohering, uncohering, dissipating.
What is the relationship with fire and air in this emptiness, right? Of and what's interesting for me, because what comes up without again my caveat of this is not the caveat that's always there. Ohani Meiji, of if we're going to go into what is publicly discussed of things that are found there, you know, when we're talking about, like I mentioned, that possession is said to be found there, the hands and feet, the notion of celebrity is born here. This is belief is born here. There's a lot of things that are just kind of here. There's this notion of this is a sign heavily owned by Eshu, and this notion of flow, that here is where things get stuck on the riverbend or at the dam that naturally creates itself, or by the genius of humanity is interfered with so that there's a natural buildup here. And so the thing is that there's a container here because naturally spiritual energy will be flowing through us. And I'll go back to like Fortuna Major in that way, that like naturally this air of spirit would be flowing through us. The fire that is the heat of our body and the air of our spirit would be flowing through us. But when it's damned, and I don't know how this relates to the elemental activations of the sign, but
Mm.
this idea of a damming of something, of blocking something, allows for what is a container but a block, right? But container itself is more karker, is this enclosement in that way, and we've moved it down. We've kind of gotten it towards the gullet, but here's like the mouth of it all. Like we have to open up top. It has to kind of, if we follow like how is something swallowed, then you're going to go from like a caput draconis to maybe or Fortuna Major is here, but I could also see realms of Puella and things of like how big is this gulp you're taking down? How big is the bolus
Mhm.
of your swallowing? Sometimes we got to swallow a big pill. But
Mhm.
so the damning of something itself to make it evident to like this idea of investing belief or allowing for the possession of something in this way is interesting, that this is the start of where spiritual medicine is, because there's a flag. This is
Mm.
not It's not an overwhelmingly negative thing at all, but there's a flag here of like this is where we start of noticing trends because there is abundance.
Mm.
We before this, it's hard to know. It's hard to know what the game that's being played
Mm.
is as much. Um, Territorial conquests are noticeable in this sign.
Mm.
This covers everything from economic to spiritual and like health. It's a very comprehensive sign, but it's also one that we pray for the stagnation to go away. Right? We want this to keep building so that we can persevere and whatever the medicine is. If we need to contain, then we need to contain, and if we need to break through, we need to break through.
Mm.
But it can't stay what it is.
Yeah.
And so that's interesting side of it also, in just the fleetingness of Fortuna Major versus like uh Fortuna Minor. It just the difference in the images themselves, right, is interesting to consider, like this flip sign of the gift is given but it has no grounding
Mm.
versus the gift is grounding.
Yeah.
Whatever you're able to do, whatever God descends, whatever Holy Spirit fire descends upon your head here, it has water and earth to like plant it and make a seed.
Yeah.
Whereas for Minor, in the opposite way, is the gift is there, but you have to seize it. It's
Yeah.
not going to be something that stays around long. This is why it's the quick fix, right? In
Yeah.
Fortuna Minor versus Fortuna Major, which is like there's something else being hinted at here.
Mhm.
And what that is, I don't know. Like maybe it's maybe Owani is playing into the water earth more than just like the possibility of fire and air. What is it to be the negation of an elemental point versus just the absence of a solid access to it? I
Yeah.
don't know. Because again, we've talked in our own times and own circles of thought about how various schools of thought are going to emphasize the active elemental points or not.
Mhm.
But is the absence of something the same as neutrality? Is the neutrality of something like what is it that is being actually taken on by the two, by the passivity? Because
Yeah.
passivity doesn't imply absence at the
No.
same time.
No. No.
It's not actively asserting itself. So it's passive to the nature. And there's something interesting that in that too, of like if you go in like on a lovely Gurdjieffian tangent of like active to the passive and passive to the active as the job of the human in the room,
Mm.
that okay, with Fortuna Major, you're looking at being passive to the things of fire and air, but being active to water and earth, that the sign itself asserts itself in water and earth, and the flip being Fortuna Minor of being active to what's not to what's fleeting,
Yeah.
to what's hot in the moment, and
Mhm.
not active. It doesn't mean that you can't apply activity
Yeah.
and emphasize how to ground, how to make those points active, which is a form of remediation, which is the whole point for. I would say most modern diviners have caught on to the point that remediation is a desired thing,
Yeah.
and it is something that yes has existed in Western divination, but it is also something that was woefully ignored as the early modern period gave way to the modern period, and fortune telling became fortune telling as opposed to divination. And so like no one's caring so much about how to get a good husband so much as tell me my husband's name.
Right.
Uh, and how to do magic to make the good husband a good husband. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I'm curious what that is in the sense of like I do like the models of showing the hashes of being you're actually doing three here, not two, like right? Because even when we draw it, we don't put columns of two, we're actually making columns of three.
Mm.
And there's a difference of like there's something in the there or not, and there's something on the edges that's either there or not.
Yeah.
But they're still both contain the ghostly imprint of their opposite so well.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And that's again that yeah, not just active and passive, but like receptive, right? The receptivity of that thing, like the ability of it to look outwards as well as to focus either inward or act and react, right?
yeah.
Um, hopefully not like reactively. Yeah. There's
Uh,
the sense of like the earthiness of Fortuna Major is interesting to me. There is a way of reading, I think, from a kind of French origin of grouping the elemental figures by or grouping the elementality of the 16 figures by the first two lines and two and two double dots for the fire and air line is considered a marker of an earthy figure. I also like the kind of borrowing of like reading hexagrams as two trigrams, that it's like earth on top kind of thing, the idea of like the weight of the world on your shoulders. And there's some earthiness to there's definitely some earthiness to Fortuna Major. Like it's the most stable and I would argue like potentially responsible of the fiery figures if we go by the poor Acquisitio Cauda and F plus as all fiery figures, which is the way I read. Um, that that also means that it's stubborn, right? Like the other side of stable, the other side of a lasting thing of like those choleric mysteries of boldness and arrogance potentially, right? But it's way more stable in terms of like it's not poor rocketing off, hopped up on bravado. It's not Cauda's like unleashed violence burning the world down. It's not Acquisitio's unmitigated gain with its like fluctuating incomes and outgoings to where it can be growth for the sake of growth. Acquisitio can be very stable, but it's not terribly responsible, right? It's all about finding the legal loopholes and about like very rules of acquisition stuff, right? Whereas Fortuna Major has this potential to receive the directive and to turn that into having feet on the ground and the stomach for things in some sense.
so it's interesting to consider this then, especially I suppose in the context of like the Brasa Haristum of the figure itself always reminds me of an incense cup.
Hmm.
Um, and I guess that's just different from a goblet, even though they're often the same. But like, it's this idea that the fire and the air are things I'm putting in there and carrying around through the stability of the handle.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
there's something I was considering this too, just in the notion of as we talk about frankincense and olibanum or libanotos or any of the words incense itself. This notion of incense and that frankincense, frank being a lovely self-referential way for Old French to mean truth or high quality, which also the notion there for also of things like the true grimoire not
Mm.
being as the one that is true and the others are dishonest, but the one that is of high quality,
Mhm.
um, is certainly a Latinate kind of contagion there is interesting. But the frankincense means like this is the good shit.
Yeah.
But okay, so it's a rough transition, but a transition all the
No,
same.
it's a great one. No, it's a great one.
um,
I think that's great. Yeah. What does it mean to keep the coals going?
yeah,
The combination of fire and earth of like how do we have a fixed point of fire? The links of Fortuna Major with Leo, right? Again, fixed fire. Yes, the sun, but also the furnace that we don't want to explode. The alchemical still that we want to, the bath of fire that we want to tend perfectly. We want and like you said, we want it to burn, but we don't want it to burn all of our incense up too quickly, right? Yeah, we want it to smell good for the whole of church, the whole of Sunday, and hopefully the whole week leading up
So
to it.
this there's several myths around frankincense, and the trade routes being are very well established and documented, right? That it comes from the Horn of Africa since ancient times. That this is the eastern side of Africa is like the Swahili trade route basically of frankincense being an Eastern African export that is carried all the way to the Holy Land since ancient times. The Greek word for frankincense is literally calling it the Lebanese stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's several words here, like basically whatever culture gave it to you first, you basically named it after them, and like this is the best stuff they have.
Right.
And so like Aluban or Condor or Busmin or Lemona or all these different names. That this resin itself is evident since ancient times as being an incredibly important thing.
Mm.
It has different forms. It's not just one tree, it's a whole species of trees, the Boswellia
Mm.
trees, some of which are going through hard times, similar to a frankincense thing of like being over harvested, because it takes 10 years for the tree to start sapping and producing resin that is going to have the quality of tear that we want. They're called tears because the tree cries them, right? So it's a lacrimose.
Yeah.
Lovely symbolism there for the Mary of the Swords, as it were.
And I think it's probably that gives the rubric that the the planetary rubric of like any part of a plant by the nature of the part of it has a planetary virtue, that all roots are Saturnine. It's generally resins that are considered solary, right? The blood of the plant that dries to these tears.
Yeah.
I think it's probably a large part down to like due to frankincense that we say that about all other resins as well.
Yeah, certainly. It's interesting too because although there's this modern divide of myrrh being lunar in nature and frankincense solar, you can find just as much evidence for both being any luminary whatsoever. That frankincense and myrrh form the basis of all resins, and that what we call myrrh is not necessarily what is called myrrh, 2,000 years ago. So all of these things, and as plants themselves are wanted to change in the very sub subtleties of this, of Boswellia sacra coming from South Arabia versus Floriana is the Horn of Africa, which is contains less boswellic acids and is still one of the heavier sources for the Catholic Church. So like we know that there is aromatherapeutic use whereby the tests have been done that the medicine in the scent of frankincense does change the mood. It makes you happier. It's a mood elevator. And so the lovely dichotomy here is that in these small churches, because churches were small, because people don't know architecture well, and it's difficult to build big churches unless you know how to build big churches.
And have a bunch of people that are willing to die about it for the next 30 years.
Yeah, or 180 years, or whatever, however long it takes. Like the whole history of you want to go into conspiracies with Masons, they're like, come on, that's the real reason. Is like it's really freaking hard to build stone things and have windows, and like not fall down on you. So churches are small, and burning charcoal, which depletes the air, produces carbon monoxide, and then puts this mood elevator in you. And like mass becomes this thing where there's often the talk of like some people are so impoverished that the bread they receive at daily mass and the wine that they receive at daily mass was often a chunk of their nutrition for the day. Yeah. But like you add to that an incense, like, ooh, I'm a little high right now. Mass becomes a really fun thing, and all you have to do is stand there and shut up. But the frankincense itself is mood elevating, has always been interesting since it's definitely one of those things that is embraced by pseudoscience very heavily. That since these tests have been done and the internet has been part and parcel to those tests, that it becomes a thing. I knew it. See, they're always tapping into what was pagan before, and it's like, or just this is not a pagan Christian divide. It's kind of just like this is just incense fumigation in this way with resin is one of the things that is so worldwide that yes, in the New World we would call it copal, and we do, but copal has 50,000 different trees being called copal, and that if it was in the ancient world was already being designated, it would have just been called frankincense or incense as well. Probably incense because it's not as quote unquote high quality and citrusy, but
like spirits, it's a job title.
Yeah. I love that like all it's in some kind of attribution that all incense gets its name from frankincense, but really it's just that frankincense is the good shit.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
and I love uh the research into various uh different frankincense streams that has uh become more commonplace in recent years. You get Apothecary's Garden. Um, uh, he's fantastic at talking about the provenance of these different sources of frankincense. So Dan Rigler specifically is the owner and purveyor at Apothecary's Garden. Highly love his. You go to his site and he will show you that there are 20 different versions of frankincense there on the site, and he'll talk about the qualities of each of them and where he got them from. So he's going and visiting these people he's trying to do sustainable, I can't even talk right now. Just good trading with these families that have been doing frankincense harvesting for however long. So there is a difference between the quality and the price between different frankincenses. There is a frankincense that is good for chewing and is used like a chewing gum, which will then be antimicrobial, and your mouth will taste like frankincense as you have this thing stuck to your molars as you push it around and figure it out. If you can do that. So if you want to dive into frankincense mysteries, I highly, highly, highly recommend going over to Apothecary's Garden and extracting all the wisdom and knowledge you can from Dan Rigler, who also, he also has miracle pollen, LME, and other dragon's blood and other various ingredients, perfumes, and things like this. Is a master distiller and just a really patient teacher and a kind of an all-around amazing human being. Met him through the VGS years and years ago, and he's just he never ceases to amaze me with the quality of his products and his willingness to talk about the specific harvest of frankincense that he's selling you, which I know that we can kind of get lost in the consumer magic market of like, buying it is just as good, but buying it and knowing everything about it is perhaps a little bit better than just buying it.
Yeah.
And so I encourage that side of it. There is in the footnotes, I will the ever mythic footnotes, there is a wonderful blog post about it's a guide to the different types of frankincense. If you Google it, a guide to the different types of frankincense, Apothecary's Garden, it will come up. But it's a good guide to 12 different types and the kind of notes that are difference between them and where they're used and what the differences and similarities between them are.
Cool.
So that said, frankincense itself, did you come across any specific descriptions other than, this is the pinnacle of everything and we have to adore it?
Yeah, I mean, it being the pinnacle means like it's at the forefront of debates about what we're doing with fumigation in general, which I find interesting. There are two predominant fumigation strategies in the pre-modern kind of magical protocols and work that I'm familiar with, which are basically boiled down to good smells for good spirits versus good smells for attracting any spirit. So like John Aubrey talks about good spirits are delighted and allured by sweet perfumes as rich gums, frankincense, like specifically right there. And, says that obviously this is why the priests of the Gentiles use it and also the Christians in their temples. And then says, evil spirits are allured by fumigations of stinking things, henbane, and those are the things that witches use. And then you get Paracelsus saying with typical Theophraston bombasticism that everyone else is doing it wrong. Where's the quote? "Oh, thou fool and unwise sacrificer, who art hitherto ignorant of these things and understandeth them not. In this place thou mayest be taught the contrary, how that malignant spirits are not driven away with sweet perfumes, but are mightily delighted therewith, and do run more freely and swiftly to them than to stinking smells, whether they be good spirits or evil. But if instead of frankincense and myrrh, you had been taught a fumigation of asafoetida, you might therewith drive away both good and evil spirits." So there's this like tension that goes on, which is only further complicated by the idea that you can also burn things that a spirit doesn't like to deliberately vex them, to make them do whatever you want to do, right? Lily gives this example of a conjurer, John of Windor, who he says again, it's part of Lily's long list of magicians I have met and disapproved of, where he says like he was sloppy, so what he would do is that he would fumigate sometimes to vex the spirits, and fumigate with contraries. And vexing a spirit is to torture them into doing whatever the conjurer wanted, whether that's forcing them to appear and deliver the nigromantic goods, or flee from, say, a possessed victim. So there's this tension that's going on with what it's doing, but the other side of that is that like it doesn't just elevate people; it elevates spirits, or elevates. That could be one way of framing it. If you're talking about saving demons, or taming or shaming them, or getting them to mend their wicked ways, but also a way that it delights them, right? And we're back to it being one of the main incenses of offering in the Verum, because these are said to be spirits that like it, right? I see people, I've encountered people kind of turning their nose up at this, like, why are you giving frankincense to demons? But even by there are many logics by which that makes sense, along with the fact that these are elemental spirits, they are called elemental spirits. It's also specifically said that some of them are particularly of an affinity with the sun. That can also mean that they are prideful, right? So it's also a way of like giving them their due. So there's a sense of like potential bribery at points. There's also a sense,
I absolutely, sorry, that just chimes in of like, because I've asked that question specifically in the past of some people that I greatly respect. And there's this similarity of you don't get frankincense until you do the job. Like I can, and there might be a little bit of a weird Christian spiritist lilt in that of like, I'll reward you with the stuff that elevates you to your kingly status and recognizes you once you act like a king.
Right.
So is that a Calvinist spiritist thing of like, prove to me that you're the king you say you are, and I will give you kingly dues. But until that point, the bad stuff with you. Sulfur it is.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot more sense than thinking that you can elevate. For me anyway, it makes a lot more sense than like, I will save them. I can change him, right? I think makes a lot more sense to be like, good job, and if you want more of the good stuff, then like let's keep doing good stuff. That makes a hell
if
of
you
a
want
lot
the
more
good
sense
shit, do the good shit.
Right. That makes a lot more sense.
That's gonna be a reduction now of frankincense, that it's the good shit. All right, sorry to stop your flow. I just wanted to agree with you.
No. That's pretty much all I had to say about that. And it's found in blends. There are a bunch of different incensings for Verum, but it's also couldn't really talk about it without giving a shout out to the three magi as well. It's the main ingredient and gift, along with myrrh and gold. By most of the charms, like the ones for generally tagged as for falling sickness, but used for all sorts of other stuff. It's Casper or Jasper or Gasper has the myrrh, Balthazar who has the gold, and Melchior in the middle who has the frankincense. That's not always the case, and it's not always that Balthazar is the oldest and Casper's the youngest, but it's the ones I've found more common, with obviously like regional exceptions and stuff, especially in places where there's a lot of frankincense that grows here. Melchior probably came from here, which is a common thing that happens when people like adopt the magi in terms of their actual locale. And so given their resin gift giving, it makes sense that fumigating is a huge part in magi practices, especially in the Rauchnacht, the smoke nights leading up to 12th night Epiphany. Also because Christmas is Ghostmas, right? Is when all the spooks and ghouls are out, and so we want to make sure that we are telling them either not to come here or to be in a good mood, so they don't want to mess with our stuff. I even found a lovely, not just a recipe, but a whole example of why the formula is what it is from Joseph Blagrave's Astrological Physic, when he's talking about concocting a solary, specifically Magian fume for casting out devils from this maid who was employed to dispossess. He says that he makes this fume from 3 substantial matters of things which are solary, and he's not on these. The 2 main dispossessing ingredient planets for English practitioners are the Sun and Jupiter. Bodenham's a big Jupiter girl. Culpeper and Blagrave are big solary boys. So he's like, it should be solary. And the other big thing is that you use select numbers of ingredients. So That's a huge thing around like using them for working with spirits at all, let alone making spirits do what you want. It's just select number of prayers, which is definitely an inheritance from the old religion, right? Doing a certain number of Our Fathers and things like that. But it's also a sense that like you would say those with each ingredient you add. So there's a numerology to good formulary. And he says like the number 3 is used because it's attributed to the sun. It's the number of the Blessed Trinity. He also has this thing about how it's the nature of time because it's past, present, and to come, which I thought was fun, and that the sun is those things as well as the Trinity is the sun is the sun. And then he's like, oh yeah, and also I considered that the 3 wise men brought gifts unto Christ, viz. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh, which are gifts of all of a solary quality or virtue. And again, that doesn't mean they're exclusively only solary, but we can think about them all as having solary virtue. And are under the dominion of the sun. Whereupon I made the choice of the 2 latter, frankincense and myrrh, but instead of gold, answering this question, this perennial matter, like how do you substitute gold in an incense blend? Do you know, or do you use gold? He took rosemary. The answer is always rosemary. And I made the fume, which I continued until the work was ended. And so I like that as an example of like, by their example. So not just doing Magian things. You know, the Magi are not just for Christmas, but for life, right? And also offer us a bunch of different historiola for giving the gift of health, of making your way through the dark to the light, of being generous.
So says the Magi enthusiast, of course.
Exactly. And so frankincense and rosemary both turn up in a lot of specifically exercising blends. Also interesting to me in terms of like putting everyone the good shit, putting everyone in a good mood. The Cambridge Book of Magic gives it as it gives 2 different incenses for Saturn, one of which is the usual blend for like Saturnine heavy shit, which is sandalwood and sulfur. But the incense of Saturn, if the work is to quote bend tongues, is also frankincense on its own. Which is also something that Cambridge Book says solary stuff is very good at. Again, the overlap of solary and Jupiterian stuff to get honors, to get your promotion, to get your favors from superiors, from the lords, from your bosses, and to encourage people to speak well of you.
It's interesting. I think one of the things that's always struck me of formularies from Brazil, for instance, is the lack of frankincense. And I probably could do more to understand the trade routes and the necessity of things. I wonder if the church is hogging what little frankincense is coming in. You do see in the early manuals of Umbanda and Spiritism and even Candomblé for various fumigations, which is really probably more of an Umbandomblé by the time things are being published, is a reliance on benzoin as like it's part and parcel to every single incense recipe, to put benzoin and lavender and basil and myrrh and rosemary. And the myrrh is itself like its own. It's like, what is myrrh? Myrrh is a darker resin that we don't really know what it is. And there's also native resins like copaiba or breu in Brazil, and the various copals that are all kind of like a weird mix, but they're not allowed to be called frankincense, but they could be burned. So there's like, what they'll call like incenso, like whether they're going to call it by various names of indigenous tribes or things like that. It's like, well, that's the copal from those people, but it's not frankincense. And I find it interesting because, for one thing, I eventually can't stand that like benzoin just becomes so that heavy vanilla. It's like myrrh with vanilla by the time it's done, right? Whereas frankincense has a much higher pine and citrusy notes to it usually. And so you get also this variation within copal, by the time you're going with Mexican thought and modern ideas about what is the highest quality copal, is the stuff that is not native to Mexico anymore anyway. It's like native to trees that are in Southeast Asia, which is, where benzoin is also heavily farmed. But they're like the stuff that smells most like frankincense, the highest citrusy and piney notes of like a white copal. You're like, this isn't really the native copal either. But the copals that we're used to are much less refined and are more woodsy and are more like what we would call myrrh. And so there's these what's sold as myrrh and what's sold as incenso at any market of witches or apothecary is quite interesting, because then that becomes what you know as incense, whether or not it's frankincense or not. And I think similarly, like, what do you do with storax, the storax styrax debate of like when things go rare, or sandalwood, and there's a lot of artificial wood chips that are like, this is a different color sandalwood that's now mixed with the essential oil or a fragrant oil of something else to simulate sandalwood. All of that goes into it too. So I think there's notions of like adaptation and understanding of how things go in this way, but certainly it is notoriously the basis of Catholic incense, frankincense, myrrh, and lavender being heavily kind of put in together to create this various recipes. And
what church smells like.
Yeah, and especially it's interesting too because the Catholic Church keeps these kind of like the Western incense tradition going along just fine, of like add some resins, add a little bit of oil and some natural plant ingredients, and that's what we put in. Versus like the Eastern Orthodox is like grind it into a pill, make a dough, put stamp Jesus into it 45 times.
Yes.
Do all these things into it, and like then cut that into pills, which like we associate with the Eastern Mediterranean far more than we do the Western Mediterranean, and Rome and West is very much like, just some kernels is fine. That's good enough. But the Eastern Orthodox are like, no, essential oils, tears of a virgin, put on this rock that the saint died upon, pound this thing in, put the bread thing in there, could have put a communion wafer in there too, then splash the wine in it and let it dry for 43 days, and then bring it back. And the incense itself has so much invested in it, even though it looks so refined and crazy that you put it on a coal and you're like, whoa, this is complex. So I think that's interesting too. And I wonder if part of that that I've heard from an economist is that the grinding of things is, yes, it comes out of a tradition where you have, you have so many, the wealth of ingredients, the embarrassment of riches, but also that when you can't get good incense quality, resin quality, you have to mix it with other things. And so meaning kicks in and all these other things kick in. Whereas in the West, if the church is hoarding the trade routes of where frankincense goes and says, this is ours from time immemorial, they don't need to make it into little cakes.
Right. Handfuls.
Yeah. So there's an interesting thing there. I'm sure I would love to know what the truth is, but I also love this myth of like, good ingredient, don't have to make new things out of it. Mediocre ingredients have to start, where does chef come into play? Like anybody can eat an apple off a tree, but like, what is it to heat that and make a pie? I don't know, because I don't always know if it's just specifically because you don't have good ingredients, because it doesn't make sense for food. But certainly, how can we make it better is its own value too. So I guess I go back and forth, and I'm curious what the reality of it is. And anybody who has a background in the trade economies of incense, I'd be very curious. But it is of note that the Mount Athos Cyprian incense is a very guarded recipe, and it has variants all over Greece. But like theirs is considered like the pinnacle of like this black incense that is definitely mixed into a dough, and one person's job is like, that's the consistency right there, that there's this check. But it's also that like when you mix it, then one ingredient can become through contagion a football field of paste, as opposed to that one good chunk of resin that you had in there. If you don't break it up, then one that's going to fall in a charcoal, and it's going to be a real good time when that hits there,
right? And then it's done.
Yeah, I think that part of it is stretching the good ingredients as well. But I'm musing and blah blah blah.
No, that makes sense.
You touch on also we touch on that in idea of stretching things and not eliminating, and where we're going is to perhaps eliminate impurity, but to stretch the purity of certain good ingredients across the board so that everybody gets a little bit of the highest quality incense. In the way that you can mix box wines and suddenly it tastes good. There's something in parallel here to calcination, which is perhaps in removing impurity. For one, makes it fucking easier to store, and allegedly, let's say, easier to disguise what it is that you're mixing or storing. It also eliminates bad smells. Let's be clear. Everything smelling like charcoal is a much more welcome thing than things smelling like rot, whether it's plant rot, which smells, like the worst, blue plate special in a back alley in 2002 on a hot day. I've heard, or, whether it's animal rot or death itself in a jar, it's so much easier to calcine something. And whether we're talking going to black ash, which by most culture standards is where you can stop for ingredients into things, or whether you're going to go to the white ash and to make the salts of something.
Right.
And not necessarily to make the stone, but the stones are in evidence of what is needed to the salts are needed to make the stone.
Yeah.
So hey, calcination. There we go.
Calcination. Alchemy is everywhere. Yeah.
And calcifer the meteorite in Howl's Moving Castle.
Oh, calcifer. I saw a what do you call it? A nightlight that was calcifer the other day.
Oh,
It's like,
I love this. So as my aside, as here is the ADHD goat. Fuck you, Doug. Fuck you. That at the beginning of, I think it was Howl's Moving Castle, or because sometimes they do previews for other Miyazaki things in the beginning of that. But I think at the very beginning of the Howl's Moving Castle DVD, remember those? A Disney executive comes on and talks and is praising Miyazaki and why Miyazaki is such an important evolution for animation, and talks about how only Miyazaki could create a castle that has doors that open to multiple locations. Meanwhile, I'm like, you're supposedly one of the people on the higher ends of this project, and you're talking about something that is based on a book by Diana Wynne Jones, who had a castle that opened anyway. That's not to say that Miyazaki isn't a fucking genius and it's brilliant in many things. But when you're talking about changing, I believe Welsh, but British novelists saying that and erasing her from the context, I was like, come on. There's so many things you could have done that. Princess Mononoke would have been a much better example for like talking about originality. But like, anyway, that's my thing. Calcifer, I still feel you. Like you still exist in your original form. It's okay.
Half spirits all the way.
Yeah. Fuck you, Doug.
For the
Fuck
half spirits.
I love you, Doug. So this notion of calcification,
Right.
where do you mind go with this?
I think in thinking about like purifying with fire, right? Like all those like lofty alchemical things about like redeeming nature. I like the pun of things being cured in and by fire. As you're pointing out, like it's not just a theoretical dross that's being taken out. It's also like you said, smells and the physicality of the thing. That things powder down, like that things char down real small. That you get rid of everything you don't need for the getting at the essence of things. It's a matter of concision. That it's part of the solve, right? The taking apart of a thing to be able to put it back together stronger in the coagula, especially when we're talking about like salts and stuff like that. That there's the inherent necromancy of it all, that a thing is killed to be resurrected by combination with a harmony greater than the sum of the parts, and also just in the little experience I've had of doing it and making simples and spagyrics and things, that it's not necessarily a quick process either. That it's not the same as flash cooking or instant conflagration, but it can be quite a laborious one, especially if you're going all the way to white ash, of refining and slow cooking, and in the sense of like the an albedo, a small a albedo period. It teaches patience and care and comprehensive coverage and things like that, as much as it's about yay fire, yay burn it all down. But also there's some potential for burning it all down as well. That's kind of where my mind goes with it.
Yeah, it's interesting how my mind, the minute I say calcifer, then I'm gonna say calcification instead of calcination, and I can hear myself and go, have I been saying which one all the time? I don't fucking know anymore. Calcification, calcium making, calcination, alchemical process, which is what we're honing in on, which I believe we said correctly at the start of the show.
So.
But who knows? Yell at me, it'll be fun. But so calcination is one of the vital processes required, right? For complete alchemical transformation, and there are at least two types of calcination. You're going to argue that there's three or even four, but actual, potential, and philosophical. So actual and potential, of course, are the primary diametric pairing here. Of actual is that which is brought about by actual fire, wood, coals, fuel, something being raised to a certain temperature, even sans wood, coal, and fuels. So you can calcine something inside a crucible. Unto white ash, which is one of the cleanest ways to do it if you have a kiln or a furnace in order which to do that. And then potential calcination is by potential fire, which is corrosivity. Gold is calcined in a furnace with mercury and solid ammoniac type of thing. So there's slight differences there. You get philosophical calcination, which is when things are hung over boiling water or some other liquid, boiling liquid, and then they lose their goo. They lose their mucilage, and it dries them out. So philosophical calcination is a drying of something, but not necessarily to the point of ash. Is my understanding that in reducing the goo of the horns, you then are able to powder it more easily. And sometimes there is something desired from the powdering of a dry substance versus the calcining of something completely to a black or a white ash. And for me, philosophical calcination, I don't, and please, my question would be, is that something like food dehydration? We both have experience with dehydrating things to powder is a very different thing, especially when the fat stays in any certain amount.
Yeah.
Whether animal or mineral fat, it changes the powdered substance dramatically, as opposed to when something is completely dry. And when that dryness point hits, I don't know. So there's the philosophical calcination. If that was said to be with like horns and hooves, went to remove the gelatinous mucilage, and you can reduce them to powder more easily. Is that akin to dehydrating something over a low heat, over 180 degrees, or a sand bath for a very long time until it is brittle, and embracing that brittleness as a means to which to break down something, but it retains more of its qualities. The sulfur obviously stays in, the smell of things stays in more when it is brittle, as opposed to when we burn off to black or white ash. The other side of the reduction and the practicality of it is hugely there. I think there's the side of it with calcination that's always fascinating to me is that alchemically it's understood one way. I think that the magical mind of the common magical practitioner does not necessarily agree that the same thing is there when you calcine something as when it's dried.
Yeah.
That somehow a fox carcass that you find in the woods and are able to pull hairs out of might have more virtue to many magical practitioners as opposed to the calcined ash salt remnants of the same. And I'm curious about that because alchemy completely disagrees, right? We have burned off the dross. We have burned off, but this is something that to effect of like, to what end? Because we're also borrowing techniques and nomenclature from alchemy, but without serving the alchemical purpose of making it perfect. And so I don't necessarily know what the thing is.
Yeah, that perfection's interesting, right? Because in some, at least in some, talking to some alchemists, there's not just a sense of burning off the dross, but this is a necessary procedure to get at things you couldn't get at by drying them. That you're getting rid of. I don't have enough chemistry. You're unlocking stuff from it. You're not just scraping off the scum and getting at the good stuff. You can only get at the good stuff by breaking it down enough that it's in that the salts are in the vital parts of it that you couldn't get any other way, which is a little bit different. I mean, you are still getting rid of the thing you don't want, but that you have to actually break apart the ore, if you like, of the thing to get it at its pure minerals.
So it brings up the point within things like fumigation, where if we're talking in a Agrippa recipe where there are things that are solar or Jupiterian in nature of whether it's eagle's brains or heart's brains and things like this, where if it's used for a suffumigation, we should automatically assume that calcination, or at least that hint towards calcination, is part of the suffumigatory act, and it should not be something that is already calcined. But that if you do not have it in uncalcined form, the calcined form would be better than none. It would be my gradation. Or is it image magic that takes its place? Or, is it, can you, if you were supposed to use a heart sprain and you don't have heart sprain, for many reasons, because even when you get them from hunters, if the animal is shot in the head, they can't legally sell it to you in this country in most states. It would have to be a bow through the heart or something like that, and then they could sell the brains in some states, but because of brain contagion and parasites, it's still illegal to sell the brains in many places. So having looked for these things way back in my youth, there are ways to get it and ways to not get it, and more often there are more ways to not get it. So allegedly, but could you draw the image of a deer in frankincense powder and use, or whatever powder is being called for elsewhere in the recipe, and invoke image magic? I think so, because that's
there are definitely examples of using of that in a variety of amulets that have pictures of things on them. That like there's all sorts of passion magics, both for like stoking it and also for helping people manage and down regulate it, involving the classic Venusian works, but instead of using an apple, you carve a picture of someone holding an apple on it, and it has in some of those operations, it has exactly the same virtues as using the apple. So yeah, I think so. I think the other side of it, I think image magic in that context seems to have a precedent and a long history of use. I think the other side of it is how are the ingredients agreeing with each other, right? What part of the eagle brain, the blood of animals, is not just there for its virtue added to the virtues of the other things, is not just there in terms of how does that blood interact with that brain matter, in terms of the spirits of them and how they get on, the harmony of the work gang of the recipe, but also like what is that matter in that state doing, right? The blood is often a way of being able, or the wine is often a way to formulate them into the pellets, into the little pat things, that because in some of those recipes you do need to stamp the name of God or a particular planetary sigil into the lozenges, right? So yes. At what point is it not just what the ingredient is, it's not just where it's from, it's not just how you got it, it's also what state is the matter in that's going to affect the thing to be able to loose its virtue and direct it in the best way when you do put it on the coals.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because in the consideration of good smells mean good spirits and bad smells mean bad spirits, and we can talk through this, and it's one thing that I know Harold has warned in his own explorations over the years of like, it is going to smell bad if you put bad, like rotting things into your incense or organic material. Even if it's dried, it will release a smell when it's burnt. So, but we can also ask, like, we're not necessarily invoking the planet on its good side. We could be invoking the planet in its totality, which includes a lot of elemental and other spirits that are there, through which they manifest in this plane. So I do think that there's something to part and parcel for what is being burned and boiled as these things, because certainly for Agrippa gives the fumigation of the sun first, and this is, oh god, whichever book. It's funny that my brain just turns off. It's right before the collieries chapter. I remember that. But
yeah, magic
other magic we get to talk about sometime. So I'm curious there, and Z at VGS was I told to reach out to you specifically. I'm just remembering this now on collieries because they were very interested in the history of them.
Cool.
So like with sun in this manner, if you have where he's talking about saffron, ambergris, musk, lignum aloes, lignum balsam, fruit of the laurel, cloves, myrrh, and frankincense, all which being bruised and mixed with such proportions may make a sweet odor, must be incorporated with the brain of an eagle or the blood of a white cock after the manner of pills or troches, which is exactly what you're saying, that you're using a mash now in order to make it into, or at least after the manner of, to mix it into one thing together. So
the proteins are doing their thing.
Yeah, so you're also, he doesn't give that instruction continued. He does often, though, list organic material at the end. So the head of a dried frog, eyes of a bull, and the seed of a white poppy, frankincense, camphor, so that's already there. That's organic, but it says dried frog, and we assume the eyes of the bull are dried because wow, that's going to be funny. But incorporate catamenia, which is menses, menstrual discharge, or the blood of a goose. And then giving this is interesting that like there's these options of brain of a cat or blood of a bat, blood of a stork or a swallow, or the brain of a hart for Jupiter. So again, I do think that he's leaning towards what you're saying of we got to put some mushy stuff in it, and it's got to be appropriate to it, and this is why this is important in this way. I've seen people argue that it's because it's a memory of sacrifice and things like this, that you can get all these things from other people that are making them. These things are possible to get without doing the killing yourself. I don't think there's any such moral virtue about animals being killed or not killed at the time of writing. Maybe towards spirits, yes, but not for any means of like, come on, like that horn of Venus is like, that's an extremely painful thing to dehorn an animal by pulling off the living horn. And no one horns like that because it's considered brutal. Dehorns like that anymore. But I'm curious where, again, could calcined matter be substituted in this way? Well, if you want to be letter of the law, yes, it's better than nothing. But at the same time, like you're saying, it's serving an actual purpose from the consistency of its constituency.
Yes, that's a lovely way of framing it. Yeah, exactly.
Because
Yeah.
who doesn't love an alliteration?
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I think calcination itself and calcification for that matter, ossification is pretty much where we find ourselves in arguing about calcination.
Mhm.
Of making a bone about things that do not need to be so static. But it's interesting the idea, like, okay, when we're doing a fumigation, it's not quite calcination, but it's because nothing burns so perfectly. And when you add a resin in, like frankincense, you add too big a glop, it can drown the charcoal that you're on, which is a whole balance that is really important for people to understand. Or you'll spend a lot of money on high quality incense and just not using enough charcoal to get it going. And then that's its own window of discussion. But I am curious, this like pseudo alchemical, I don't have the answer, and I know we've already been talking about it, but the idea of we are not borrowing the alchemical nature or process or worldview, other than to say that burning something means I can store it more easily.
Yes. There is
that's
great practicality. Yeah.
Yeah, and so is it the pseudoscience? Is it the pseudo alchemy in order to say that of like, if I find said roadkill, can I burn said roadkill so that I do not have to keep said roadkill in my freezer next to the toaster strudels?
Yeah. Well, there's all sorts of examples as well of like, grimoires that are like have very specific astrological conditions where you have to do certain things and can't do certain things in those times. There's also a sense in some of them, again, in rereading the Cambridge Book of Magic recently, of like, you could, just because you can't do that operation until the sun is in that sign later in the year doesn't mean you can't be doing something. And again, coming back to this idea of like preparing things, there's always something going on. The stars are always doing something, right? Time is always timing.
We go back to this, God love her, Silver Raven Wolf Teen Witch, of like, may all astrological associations and elections be in favor for my working that I'm doing right now. That's a lovely prayer.
Fingers crossed, right? Yeah. Better a Hail Mary than not, right? I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
But this notion of being able to keep things, of like, do the thing that is available for you to do this week and then store it. That's, I think I've said before, that's why in the manner that Della Porta talks about making sigils, is so that you can store like specific astrological, not just election for making the sigil, but the sigil is a battery or you've caught lightning in a jar of that particular election, so that you can use it again. He compares it to making jam, as do several historians of magic, that when that fruit drops, you gather it and you prepare it, yes, in a way that ensures its virtue is not lost, but also its virtue isn't lost over time, and that like you are then capable of storing. Like, the idea of storing things seems pretty baked into this concept that you do things at certain times and then like prepare them so that you can then use them and the jam hasn't gone bad when there's nothing fruiting and you fancy some jam. Does that make sense? Or is that just me saying jam a lot?
I like jam.
Yeah. That like, it's a sterile container that you found a way to keep it tasting good, keep it doing the thing it was doing at that time, when the trees aren't doing that.
There's the thing of like, if we take things in terms of deficit and abundance and hunger versus satiation, if you're hungry and yes, you want baked Alaska, but the only thing you can get is lemon sorbet, there are times where you're gonna be like, lemon sorbet is fine, I'll fucking deal with it.
Right.
So, and it ends up becoming a lot of times when we're talking about magic that is brought about through, I need desired change in my life, that beggars can't be choosers. And one of the huge divides of high magic versus low magic is, if you have the privilege of waiting around for the election to even know what an election is, then by all means wait. And if you don't, then figure out what makes it work. And so one is borrowing the hands of privilege to enact magic on a quicker scale. And I think that part of that is impatience. But a lot of it is need originally.
Yeah.
And and impatience can be its own color on like, you know what, maybe it's good that you didn't have this election sitting around last night because you would have killed the person. Maybe
Right.
you should sleep on all acts of magic unless it's for like I need food or someone's endangering my family. Like then don't fucking sleep on anything.
Right.
Figure out how to do it.
Mhm.
But I think there's something to be examined there that like I appreciate elections. Elections are wonderful if you have the privilege to do it, and elections can be talked about also as many have of being the epitome of like keeping the rich rich and the poor poor.
Yeah.
Um, of like you can afford to wait, you can afford to harness the resources to garner everything, and now you have made sure that you are successful without regards to local populace or anything like that.
Yeah.
Because it's still an aristocratic magical form.
Mhm.
Um, Whereas we can argue, and I'm sure I would love to talk to Jay about that more. That like when you talk Lunar Mansion, then at least you have a chance, right? I can see the
Yeah.
moon in this station at least, and I know that it likes this thing at this time. And here's a few plants I can throw on a thing and appeal to whatever gods are active right now.
Mhm.
Like you who hear me, make yourself known, but
Mhm.
go after this bastard of a man that has fucked me over.
Mhm.
Um, when I see his downfall, I will praise you again every
Right.
time the moon goes into your station. Um, there's something there, but and you know it's just something to consider.
For sure.
I suppose with all of that too is the natural egress from there is temperance, uh,
Mhm.
or ingress, egress, the natural march towards our inevitable doom, with a
Yeah.
liquid.
Tempering,
Yeah,
through fire or through water, the alloying of things, the combining of things to be more than the sum of the parts.
and it's
Um,
interesting because temperance, 14, most notably, or sometimes 6 or 7, but is virtues have a place in many of the different Tarokian different games.
yeah.
Uh, but as far as making it into tarot, we really only see justice and strength along with temperance.
Mhm.
Usually, from any memory I have. But okay, so we see the angel with the fire sigil prominently um, there, mixing 2 goblets full of liquid. Um, and some will say that it's just the mixing of temperatures, some that it's mixing water to wine. Um, I, and yeah, there's the idea that like I think as LibriWiki quotes Paul Hewson talking about how it represented Ganymede as the cupbearer to Zeus,
Hmm.
um is interesting because then you're going to go into Aquarius notions and things like that too. But
Yeah.
it could be Iris or the Archangel Michael because there is that fire sigil upon its chest.
Mhm.
Um, the irises are what's pictured in the card too,
Mm.
as and maybe it's temperance and communication as well. That's there, and then the sun is either rising or setting between the mountains and a path leading from the pool at the feet of the temperance angel.
Yeah.
But they do wear a solar um, little doctor helmet thing. Uh, I'm curious too because I was watching as we doom scroll through life, this notion of how do you make tea on Shabbos
Mm.
um came up, and specifically because you can't cook right, so the woman was using a thermos where she can punch the back through manual labor, which puts hot water in a cup, but she can't put the tea in the cup because that might be construed as cooking.
Mm.
However, if she pours that um, hot water cup into another cup, then that is no longer cooking because it has been exposed to the cold air. And you can then put the tea bag in, and it will then still have enough warmth to make a really weak tea, which I know
Mm.
is I remember the tea story we've talked about of my dad in surgery and the British woman like hitting the nurse's aide or something like, it's not a blooming boat. Like, what is this? Fill the cup up first, shit. And like, I was also like, bat the little Pampers back down into submission, like it's Leviathan coming up from the deep. Um, but so this term of and I'm going to butcher this and I'm sorry, but Kelly Shalishi is the third vessel that water from a kettle is poured into a cup and the contents of the cup are poured into another cup. The second cup is called a Kelly Shalishi.
Mm.
And there's a whole bunch of terms used in the laws of Bishul and like trying to understand how you would keep food kosher and in observance of the Sabbath. Um,
Mm,
but I like this idea of the third cup
yeah,
or the second cup that you poured into. And it makes me think of temperance in this way, because you have the pool at the bottom being a primal cup,
yeah,
and the mixing of water into wine here, or of tempering the two waters so that they become in an equilibrium, which the point of an equilibrium is not stasis.
right.
It is actually the flow between both, so that both share in a constant exchange, in my understanding
Yeah,
of
a
how they
dynamic
work.
balance. Yeah,
Yes.
being
Uh,
tempered. Yeah, making a good mix, a eucrasia, right? That's classic. That's why you have a humoral temperament, or a temperature, as it's sometimes called. It's a good mix of body, mind, soul, and all of your life. But it's not a static thing, because time is moving. There are different. You're aging. There are different things going on. It's a dynamic blend. Just like it's not abstinence. It's not the absence of something. It's the moderation of things. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. So the earliest examples of it are definitely a woman diluting wine with water, pouring it between two containers she's holding, and generally seated. Um, and often a couple of art historians point out that the water, that the liquids are moving at like impossible angles. So there's a big like kind of the magic of that is kind of emphasized. Um, and then by the 1470s, with the Visconti Sforza deck, you get a standing lady. And
Yeah.
some historians have argued that because she's got braids and these like rolled down stockings, that she's a serving maid, whereas the ones seated are sometimes on like kind of not exactly thrones, but like it's a fancy lady. This is a
Yeah.
less fancy lady. The idea of like the service of this thing, and then
Which
by
that brings
yeah.
into mind interesting side effects of the use of a sigil on a spoon to go from the thing itself to those who use it the most.
Yes,
So like the
yes.
concept or the emblem of temperance, then being engaged with in a practical, everyday manner by those maids who might be mixing the water with the wine for their
Mhm.
masters, to be
Yeah,
emblematic of temperance in that way, in a
yeah.
way that the upper class no longer is.
Right, right, exactly. Yeah. How privileged to debate and decry gluttony
Yeah,
while someone is mixing your wine for you.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Hmm. Where we go with that next?
I'm
Oh yeah.
sorry.
So no. That's a great point. I love the spoon. Also makes me think of like love spoons and stuff like that as well. But I guess that's a little different. It's carving the handle, and how often they were used and not used, and the exchange, the thing that is made from more than the sum of the parts from one to the other. So by the Marseille pattern, you got the wings turning up in the early 17th century, and it's immediately Saint Michael. Prior to it being an upward pointing triangle, it seems to be some kind of either like a red circle or even a flower at her kind of like hairline, or where her hair parts. She's standing still at this point in this kind of S shape of that. Like, is that contrapposto? Um, yeah, I think so. And what's also interesting here is that you've got the move from earlier Italian decks where the virtues they do move in herds, to temperance between death and the devil. And this also reinforces a Michaeline lens or understanding that like after death comes the psychopomp, um, and that the angel and the devil are then a duality, and that the devil also represents temperance as opposite of gluttony and addiction and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So then the other big part is when she starts pouring the water, the images where she's pouring the water on the ground, which starts with a bowl placed on the ground, which is popular in like northern France and Belgium for about a century. And this seems to appear from around 1650. And at this point, she's holding a scepter as well, and she's also got a crown, so she's back to being Fonzie. And specifically, there's in some of them there's a ribbon floating near her head saying fame alone, which seems to be a reference to Boiardo's poem about after death only fame advances. So it's the other side of like what happens after death, infamy. They've all got it, infamy. So this idea of like tempering your ambition, I guess, starts to come in. This notion of like restraint and moderation. So again, back to a little bit back to Saint Iggy, right? Like, what do you do when your grand schemes get dashed or are tempered by something else, and how do you make something and indeed like
when your Sigma plans get skibbidied, yeah.
Yeah, and that's also with this like becomes less there is a re-emphasis, it seems, on restraint and moderation, not as just moral virtues, but of the card starting to symbolize a return to good health, so getting back to its like root, like humoralism.
Yeah, it's that side of it is fascinating, right? Because like the card famously depicts by the time you get to Rider Waite, which is a purposeful drawing, like in a way that it was always purposeful, but because someone had to make it. But like 1 foot in water, 1 foot on dry land. The sun is on the horizon, so it's neither setting nor rising. It's not in the sky. It's not below this horizon. To have, yes, it's iris, and that can be very specific, but also that it's a marsh plant, that it's a plant that grows both in water and soil at the same time. To have, there's a large argument that this is Michael. Of course, you're dealing with neither God, but who is like God. And although it doesn't say Michael, the writer Waite does say Yod Heh above the triangle, very small. And that's taken out as the decks get more and more increasingly popularized in pagan circles, where angels are okay, but God is bad. But so I think you could argue that temperance, ironically, sets us up for the holistic view of the devil card that many of us embrace later. Of or even the initiation rites of foot neither bond nor free.
Yeah, that it's not just a path between two things. There's a dialectical that starts to replace that, as the two cups in the alchemical act create an entirely new third substance. It's not just about the right blend of two things of the good, or even of saying a blend of good and bad. It's that the both of them combine to a third thing.
So you're dealing with the Masonic, Boas and Jakin, and the initiate walking between them as creating the alternative third path, the middle path.
Yeah. And there's even links to how when the French occultists start assigning the Hebrew letter of Nun to the card, they read that as in that way of letters having a word associated with them as well. They read it as meaning offspring or fruit. It's this idea of like a third thing being generated from this process.
From the mixture of the male and the female comes the child, yeah. And then you also get that mutability of like its association with Sagittarius and Jupiter, right? That this is the actual during the feast. How do we do this so that the Jupiterian energy can be preserved? The frivolity can be maintained. Well, you can't have people too drunk. So you want them joyous but not drunk. Who is better than that than a Sagittarius?
Right. Also, again, like you're saying, there's still this hybridity. There's still this not quite fully one or the other with a half human, half animal.
But still, that the mind of the man is above. There is no mind of horse there. That there is bestial nature, but the heart and mind of the man are the thing that are driving the horse.
Yeah, so there's development going on, and then of course it's not just a centaur; he's an archer as well, and so then you get the arrow of Sagittarius pointing up the tree of life to prefigure temperance,
which I never fully thought about, but in the Doric room of the Grand Lodge in this city and state of New York, there are battles with the centaurs around the top of a room, and they always ask, what do you think that means? And I never really put it together that it was a perfect example of temperance, right? That I understand the nature of man fighting with the centaur, that like no human being is pure animal, and I get that side of it, that like the idea of being like, and again, we're coming to the Gurdjieffian split here, that some people will say we're only human and therefore that excuses our foibles. I would go the other way and say that, we potentially can be human, that we don't use our humanity well. We don't use the things that we are capable of, and that's okay. But like, let's not blame it on our The divide here can be that there's purpose and that we should hold ourselves accountable, that we could do things differently in the
Right.
kind of examine of Loyola of like, what could I have done differently today? So that the
Yeah.
human wrestles with the centaur, meaning that we are either centaur or we are human at
Mm.
any one given choice moment. And so like we have these base instincts, but we're still ruled by the potential of our humanity.
Yeah.
And that temperance is that battle between those things.
And that development also having I mean, like the most famous centaur being Chiron, right? Like
Yes.
this idea that this is still, there can still be a healing going on, right? We can still
Yeah.
acknowledge what we've when we've made bad decisions and where that comes from, and trying to trying to shoot for a better tomorrow.
I'm still going to point out the thing that continually fascinates me is the move for the reversed card to mean the opposite of what has been shown rather than an intensification of. And
Mm.
it's a split in the tarot schools because some of us just don't read opposites.
Mm.
I was trained to look for contextual reversing's.
Mm.
So that like, yes, the card is reversed, but it doesn't mean anything unless there's other cards around it that might mean that we should pay attention to that reversal.
Mm.
Because I'm not ordering all the cards upright in between every deck, and or splitting half of them evenly anyway.
Yeah.
So it becomes this thing of like, it needs to be paid attention to in context, but that's part of a school of like the open reading school and other ideas of like when you're using Marseille as a base as opposed to perfect formation in like a Celtic cross with specific cards that are meant to evoke a certain mystery.
Mm.
But if you look at Pictorial Key to the Tarot, Waite's definition right there of temperance, like economy, moderation, frugality, management, accommodation, and then reversed is the institutions connected to temperance. Connected with churches, religion, sex, and the priesthood. Sometimes even the priest who will marry the querent. Yes, also disusing unfortunate combinations and competing interests, but it's an intensification of an issue around temperance. So temperance by itself is a good card that is like, what does this mean? And when you go into a what is the modern way of reading tarot very heavily of spreads, that I am designating this card. I don't know how the card knows that that's what the spread is supposed to be. But the idea that rather than go through context and do a line of 5 or a grid of 9 and go, this card has to be influenced by the quadrants around it, the corners here, the central card is the primary focus. So we're looking at an issue of temperance, of balancing something. But if there happens to be, heavily male cards on one side and heavily female cards on the other, and the person is, presenting themselves as heteronormative, you're like, okay, what's the issues with your partner? Like that can be something that's there, is like you're not taking enough for yourself, or there's things that can go on there based on the context of what cards are intermittently there as well. So contextual reversals, meaning what can make it more intensified, I think is still always going to be about what's next to it. Spreads you're gonna get what your mileage out of them, and that's where I think it still is that modern thing where we have through spiritism, I'm fully convinced, and the kind of popular shifting the window over, like we don't even question what's answering anymore. It's just the tarot is answering. And like, what is the tarot exactly? It isn't necessarily the Golden Dawn thing where, a certain angel under a certain name has been imbued into the deck for the purposes of divination and self-exploration, because what average person is doing that? It isn't even necessarily the anima mundi as discussed within like a geometric thing of like the spiritus mundi of like that it's the spirit of the gnomes of the earth themselves are speaking to you on behalf of the greater knowledge and understanding of the currents of what's going around.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, that's my rant. That's my meds talk as we
Your haunted talk.
yeah,
haunted talk.
I have taken a caffeine squirt in the last hour talk.
Always squirty. I think that sense of the reversal indicating an intensification is super interesting. Also, the fact that like it's institutions, it's the crystallization of the thing. It's the turning,
the calcification, not the calcination. Yeah,
exactly. It's the calcification of the thing. It's making it and of a thing that is meant to be so dynamic, imposing like must always, must never, as opposed to again, it's not contextual, right? That's where it's can become a problem, right? You also see some readings of reversal, or when it's flagging an issue, that this dynamism can be too dynamic, that it can describe someone who vacillates between options or is unable to make up their mind.
Yeah, what are other indications here? Like, is the Wheel of Fortune describing temperance, or is temperance describing the Wheel of Fortune?
Mm-hmm.
The main focus is temperance and something like that, and there's a lot of fickle cards where there's a lot of stasis, even if it's other major arcana like Hangman and Wheel of Fortune. There's this minor things of like the personality of the temperance is already in question. Of like this, are you temperate? Are you temperate because of lack of commitment, or are you temperate because you truly want to be temperate? And is it just middle of the roadness, or is it actually for the betterment of yourself?
Right.
But
Are you
there is,
balancing or just not making a choice? Yeah.
yeah, and we can argue that like one of the biases of the Rider-Waite Tarot and its inheritors, it's an incredibly Judeo-Christian moral set. That is, and ceremonial magic in general has a large inheritance of that, of like it's for the betterment of your consciousness and the raising of your vibrations. So, I mean, that's
But
not
that turns into a very like theological centrism, right? Like,
yes,
yeah.
where temperance is now reversed, and it's an institution of calcified temperance. I will tell you what is temperate and what is not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So on that notion, we'll probably have to come back because we've never ended with the stone before, but I feel like we're gonna have to come back to flint because I feel like this idea of temperance and exploring what is acceptable and what is not acceptable is perfect in like parallel, serpent hole into Levay, playing with societal notions of using the theater and the performativity of Satanism, of devil worship, of witchcraft as we know it outside the pagan stream, to bring people to a form of aha moment of perhaps to free themselves from the trappings of the same, of the things that make those assumptions. I think that's a very noble version of LeVay, and I think there are people that will argue that that wasn't it at all. But I like to think that, most magical people I know, when faced with the reality of like, do you want people to get better or not, must be like, it would be great if people got better. That doesn't mean that you want to actively do it. But
well,
it would be great.
That's the big tension, right? It seems in a lot of that stuff around, we can get into this, but like when he's talking about responsibility versus morality versus what people expect of you, can make some great points taking things down, and then we're left with like, okay, so what do we do? That's still maybe a little vague, but yeah, I like the idea of coming to LeVay now, definitely. Yeah, and I think there's an importance of being able to find things that are useful. That doesn't mean praising every dead magician as a saint or erasing any of their daft or problematic things that they've said or done. But also, if this history is to serve well, then like we can look at like what to. We don't have to rose tint when we are staring into the flames necessarily.
Yes. All right. So, Mr. LeVay.
Mr. LeVay, right. Born under the government name of Howard Stanton Levy, April 11th, 1930. Known primarily as the founder of the Church of Satan. Gets a whole adjective, which is always a sign of, being historic as well as historical in promulgating the philosophy of LeVayan Satanism specifically. Sometimes said to have founded the concept of Satanism itself. Depends on how far back we talk about what Satanism with a big or a small s is. Certainly influences modern takes on it. So I think the starting point to frame how a bunch of biographers and historians have talked about his, like you've already said, like his theatricality, his showmanship. That Gareth Medway, who's a historian of Satanism, has described him as a born showman, and Jean Lafontaine has described him as a colorful figure, which is a wonderfully a word that does so many things colorful, of considerable personal magnetism. In terms of like an early biography, I think the thing that gets emphasized a lot is his early musical interests, which is always great. You want a magician that can play some instruments. There's a lot of stuff in going through, especially his boyhood and especially his takes on his boyhood, that seem to crop up or seem to bang up against biographers, at the very least, not being able to find evidence of those things. in some cases, that's, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But in other cases, it seems that there are claims he makes that would have a record that we just don't have. So always worth framing that, like, yes, there's this particular point you've already kind of alluded to where he definitely like goes full Ming the Merciless and starts to turn his whole life into art. But there's definitely tendencies before that to be framing things a certain way. And certainly by that point, he's already framed his both this aeonic shift, but also a sense of like always having been like this. And his relationship to the past is very interesting in those terms as well. That I want to get to some points that that a couple of people have made about his relationship of how he framed Satanism and its relationship to both the past and the future. But so the big start is that like he claims to have worked at the circus as a boy, and having done a couple summers of it myself, roustaboutting is hard work. But he's claiming to be helping put tents, to be like, a carny on the ground, as well as playing instruments. And his big point here is that he got to see both the bawdy burlesque stuff, as well as the like riotous vaudeville, and that kind of influences him in the sense of the stuff he gets into himself and the kind of music he plays, as well as claiming to see the same people who were supposedly so pious and upstanding in church on Sundays being drunk off their ass and stuffing dollar bills in G-strings on the Friday night. And that this is part of his big sense of, the hypocrisy of a lot of organized religion, potentially all organized religion. He claims at various points to have been like a cage boy and other kinds of specific like circus worker. Again, journalist Lawrence Wright can't find any evidence of that. But circuses at the time were not necessarily great at keeping records either.
I mean, I also, I feel like I hear the Castaneda quote in my head. I'll paraphrase, but like, in order, the first thing of being a sorcerer is you have to go away from anybody who ever knew you. Because in order to assume the magical identity, come on, how ballsy is that? How uterine is that? I'll extend it to both strongholds, but the idea that like historical factual narrative does not myth serves the purpose of foundational creation, of creating something in that strong way. And coming from the Western tradition with the pseudo-Masonic and the actual Masonic, like tongue-in-cheek, but not really tongue-in-cheek, where some people can't really tell that like the ancient ways of Masonry and the ancient ways of the Golden Dawn, that the cipher wasn't discovered, the cipher was made. That even the application or the revelation that like when you talk to the prophets and coming back from Second Babylon, that they created the Torah as opposed to discovered it, is going to upset a lot of people because they live their lives based on the assumption that the Torah was refound. But there's no existence of the Torah before that. So there's no reason that the top leaders of the Jewish nation, which didn't exist as a unified group yet, goes somewhere, combines all their myths, comes out with this book that somehow unifies a people and gives them a history and a purpose. We see that time and time again, and that's kind of just how national identities form or group identities form. So I don't really have a problem with the fictitious Levian, like, if he says that he was, survived the gape of a giant lion chasing him for 2 years, like like sure, like let's justify that shit. I understand that there's a need for like objective reality, but like the man was obviously incorporating showmanship into like to a Barnum level or more of incorporating, and it's one of the main influences that is categorized in everything that's talked about him, right? That he's blending what's the Peterson factional quote of like, he created a belief system somewhere between religion, philosophy, psychology, and carnival, freely appropriating science, mythology, fringe beliefs, and a play in a potent mix. And play in a potent mix. And I repeat that, and play in a potent mix. This is a theatrical performative tradition that he is using to espouse and expose things. And it's really hard to tell what is truth when you're living in a world of mythic call-out. Because there's also the side of when you look at those books and you're like, why the fuck is Damballa mentioned so many times? Because it's right? It's interesting to be like, okay, voodoo is present in that way, but Damballa is not Satanistic. Like, it's just not. But you'll still the same thing when you get to Exuma and he's talking about, Sherm Forish and invoking every Loa and Orisha that he can in
Mm.
his music as a way of rebelling against the Christian norm.
Mhm.
So I like, I uh,
It's
criticism,
yeah,
criticality, yes, but also like if we get hung up on that, we're gonna confuse what he actually was talking about all
yeah.
that time too, right? Like he did shave his head on Walpurgisnacht. That's a thing,
Mhm.
at 36 in the tradition of ancient executioners. But like that's year one Anno Satanas, Satanas. Like, give it to me. This is great. Like that side of it of there's that wonderful kind of Coney Island vibe to it. There's a lot of like Hollywood feel to it.
Mm.
There's, it's a mixture of like, I don't know, by the time it gets to the 90s, it's going to be like Nag Champa leopard print and like stale red wine smell to me that I associate with it. And a gorgeous fucking aesthetic. Like we
Mm.
can't, like that is like Satanism is known for an aesthetic, and where aesthetic becomes a virtue. Now you have to move through it because it's the same thing of like, if you're only going to worship Lucifer in the fall, like what happens when he hits the fucking ground?
Right.
But, and that's not to say like, I think we both have, probably me more than you, but I have a lot of friends that are in the Church of Satan. And by proximity, the Church of Satan is now mostly headquartered in Poughkeepsie. Ancient seership and mediumship, as well as the Church of Satan,
Mm.
because that's where Peter lives. So like as Blanche handed off to Peter, and there's that whole argument of post Levian, at his death, what happens? Um, Man, fucking aesthetic and embracing that shit of it is still like it's the seductive part for a lot of people. Aesthetic as a way in,
Mm.
like, come on. Sorry, I there's a lot here with LeVay that's so fascinating. I don't realize he triggers me in the wonderful ways of like how cool would it be to like have lunch with him in the sense of like this man had a lot going on. I don't know what to believe, and I'm
Yeah.
okay with that. I'm okay in the like complete confusion of it all,
Right.
because there's something to that in the like. So if you're okay in the if you can be okay in the complete confusion, then maybe we can start looking at the values that we're automatically performing from a societal script that allows us to not have free will as much as we could. And
Yeah.
so I think there's something there. As has been discussed, there's a criticism that it worships the rebellion, but it doesn't necessarily give a ground plan as where to go after that.
Mm.
Um, and I have heard those arguments from many people, both in the church and outside of the church, that like, the criticisms of the Church of Satan, which is not LaVey, and we'll return to LaVey in a second, of it being less political than it should be.
Mm.
That it was a political entity in the mid 20th century by its existence, but at a certain point, the existence of something, its inherent politicism is it loses that power if it doesn't enact and become political. So in the same way that I would argue, surprise, where you and I are of a liberal bent, a leftist liberal bent. I'm pretty sure I can speak for you in that way. That the politics are such that, as Vito will point out, very happily, if you are going to say that you are for freedom of choice but do nothing to make sure that freedom of choice is guaranteed to the people around you, then you're not for freedom of choice.
Right. Right.
So if you are, it's all fine to say that there's this, people have to come to those decisions on their own, and I agree, individual responsibility is what you want to push forward in people. But we also have these institutions that can flag it and say, we as an institution do not stand idly by, and become apolitical. Being apolitical is a place of privilege.
Right.
That's that temperance shit where you went from sitting to standing.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah. No, no,
soapbox over, because politics is obviously a big thing as we're recording this,
no.
and in this supposed election year,
Right.
in the summer of my youth, in my early late mid 40s. But so that said, okay, so he assumes this identity. He has this amazing, it's not even a love-hate, it's a love-love relationship with the press, because it gives him the whole Barnum thing of like, or the quoting on the Spanish proverb of like, fame and infamy are both fame.
Mm-hmm.
Like everything he can spin around. I think there's something interesting to the Aquino split of, having part of the church, and an undisclosed number of people leave the Church of Satan and move towards the Temple of Set, which is specifically to embrace a theistic Satanism. And
Mm.
I've heard from various doctrines that that doesn't mean that the Church of Satan is atheistic or that he was promoting a lack of theism, but that it was an individual choice or a movement as to what the entities you were talking to were within the context of your own personal philosophy. That to not make a statement on something is very different from making a statement on something. But again, we come to the point of politicization. If you don't state what it is, people will fill that gap for you and say that's what you're doing. I think though there's a lot of politics and war with the inheritors and the children and things like that, and there's officials and there's non-official, and there's a lot of commentary there that I personally don't find useful to talk about this time. But I do think the side of it of embracing Dee's work specifically in the Satanic Bible and bringing in these kind of grimoire traditions into a Satanist bent to allow a kind of we are what you think we are type of thing, but that you were wrong all along at the same time. We are the weirdos, mister. I think that you have the famed side of it of like by the time we get to the 90s to have Marilyn Manson be so identified with Satanism and the kind of like bringing about the apocalypse through Enochian magic in your artwork, if not your songs explicitly. And what does that mean? I think LaVey's there's a criticism of LaVey that he actively shaped and took part in like conspiracy culture in order to give agency and mystique to the church. And he generally was conservative in his approach towards law, which is fascinating again for the apoliticization. Is like, is it apoliticization or is it wanting to not upset too many that they'll come after you? Because in his time period, that was still a very big thing. It still would be in certain parts of the country, period. I think it's fascinating that, in little upstate or upriver, Hudson Valley, New York, is where we're at. But like, the idea that the church should abide by state law and all of its actions was to protect the entity of the church. Now, what a person does beyond that, it's hard to know. And like, you get this idea that like LaVey supposedly hated metal music and rock music, and like his famous endorsements are from people who are in that scene. And if it hadn't been for satanic propaganda through it, that he wouldn't have indulged with it at all, because he didn't even care if it had satanic lyrics or not. It just wasn't his thing. I find that fascinating. Like I don't know. The magnetism that is proposed through the use of aesthetic as a principle and all these different ways of looking at it. And like, again, we're talking LaVey more than the Church of Satan or its tenets itself. There's something really magnetizing about his persona, the kind of Eshu Marabo, Eshu Mangeda kind of like Satanism that existed in the 50s and 60s, and then kind of reifies itself over and over that this is how you dress if you're a Satanist, comparing him to cult leaders like Koresh or Jones or Charles Manson, making sure to name the first name there, that LaVey endowed his followers with the act of rebellion as like a sacrament, that like you can rebel against me, go for it. It's a very different, that's how he's not a cult. It's very easy to leave. It's very easy to form your own opinion. Go for it. I'm not, but his marriage with aesthetic is so, and again, the goat that is in your garden, I'm sorry, so fucking sexy of like, aesthetic is not always to be shunned. Well, aesthetic itself, I don't think is shunned, but the false application of aesthetic is criticized, and rightly so, perhaps. The only other thing I think, and please, go back to all notes and every notes, I will say that I love that in like the weirdness of funerary tradition, that he's, there's question about his death date, that he seems to have died a couple days before Halloween, but the certificate specifically says Halloween.
Yes.
And that he's moved to a Catholic hospital because it's the closest available, which is always fascinating. But you get good care at a Catholic hospital, of course. That that a secret satanic funeral attended by invitation only was held in Colma, after which his body was cremated. Now, I'm quoting from the Liber Wiki here because that's just a good summary. But I don't want to breeze past Colma, because if you don't know where Colma is or what it is, I invite everyone to visit it at some point if they're on the West Coast out near San Francisco, because Colma is purposely set up as a necropolis. It is a 1,500 person town at the last census, but the town was founded as a necropolis in 1924. Most of its land is dedicated to cemeteries of people from the Bay Area. So it's specified to be somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million dead in this town. So that's 1,000 to 1 outnumbering.
Wow.
It is the city of the silent, the city of the dead. It has, if you want to know, like the bumper stickers that say it's great to be alive in Colma. So if you are a necromancer of sort, even to go amongst this city, which is specifically built to be the cemetery city for the San Francisco Peninsula, is fascinating. So that's where the satanic funeral was held by invitation only, and then he was cremated after that. There's something I don't know that stirs me as much as, like, you know, the giant stone owls of my home state.
Yeah.
So Colma, California, if you've never been, get there. Yeah.
Sounds rad. That sounds rad. I did not know that. That's really cool. Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a lot in how can aesthetic and history and myth work for us, right? I think that's a common theme that in some cases, like say, the very inaccurate frames are absolutely categorically a deliberate wink. And I've even heard some people inside and outside the church say that it's like it's a litmus for, like, are you going to think for yourself, right? How do you tell someone to think for themselves? And emphasize that, like, sure, like he's potentially a cult leader, but was about fun and autonomy and not anything full helter skelter, right? And certainly there's a huge influence on, like, the idea of, like, ritual airlocks, right? And, like, containers. And we're going to talk about being comfortable, being confused, right? Like locating suspensions of disbelief. I think it's not terribly controversial to say that, like, chaos magic is admittedly a many tentacled thing. The historical movement, trend, turn, emphases owes a lot to LaVey. And yeah, the bringing back again after Crowley does it of the Enochian calls again and satanizing them and emphasizing their aesthetic value, that it colors the air in a number of ways, to the mind, to the ear, as well as potentially to the ethers, is great. Never going to mind people playing with Enochian. I think that's is a wonderful thing. I think the thing the thing I wanted to mention was, like, another thing that Faxneld says about how he seems to identify this kind of tension between LaVey's desire to kind of enshrine and harken back to kind of infamous and important satanic predecessors, and, like, kind of capital S satanic predecessors, and also his, like, ambition, I guess we could say, to be seen as the founder of the first, like, capital P proper satanic movement. And again, like, relying on a lot of other occultists' work while also criticizing them, which is shouldn't be seen as any kind of, like, oh, you're using it, but also you don't like some parts of it. Like, absolutely, right? Again, making what we can with what we have, and looking at what it could be, like vital creative processes. And I think underlie that, like, that's what a lot of magicians do. He was just a lot more, like, obvious about it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things, he also made a Christmas record, right? Satan Takes a Holiday in 95. To my knowledge, John D never did that, right?
To your knowledge, but I'm sure it will be discovered soon and available.
That was a piece of music that was used to line a pie. Maybe. I think looking at the record is interesting in a kind of micro study of LaVey, honestly. Like, it's vaudeville stuff. There's a bunch of standards in there, some of which are made, like, a fair bit more like bombastic and stuff. There's new compositions, partly by himself, partly by other people, many of which were used for background music or for movies. And I think the
Yeah.
liner notes describes them as being background music for quote magic acts and midnight spook shows. And so I wonder if that's not a bad emblematic or just a micro study of like his kind of work, not to like reduce him to that album, but
No,
like
but I think what you're getting at is really I'm buying what you're putting down in
mm,
the sense that like he's not apologizing for destroying the sanctity of the conventional religion, so why would he apologize for destroying the sanctity of conventional magic?
yeah.
That's all of it is tools. I mean, like the thing with LeVay ultimately is that like he was happy to say that he was founding a new religion,
Mm,
right? A distinctly new religion. What's the quote? Gallagher's quote, notes. In LeVay's way of thinking, Satanism is both a distinctly new religion, which he himself, without any false modesty, invented, and the continuance of an ancient tradition of opposition to the status quo. So we see similar things in like how Wicca can inherit this kind of pastoral nostalgia that is kind of coming into as an alternative to the upper class kind of order nostalgia of some ceremonial magic that is coming out of the elite. And Wicca kind of comes at it from the bottom up and is like proposing this other kind of middle class worship of what was. But there's a lot to that as well, obviously, and I don't know if that's an accurate summary. But the
mm,
idea being that saying that the seeds of your tradition or religion have always been there is very different from saying that it's always been there. And
yeah.
I think there's a wonderful delicate line by which if the window is there that like of course you're going to jump through the fucking hoop that allows people to think that without explicitly stating it if you are selling something because
Yeah.
that's what we do as people. We're selling things and he's a fantastic salesman, the aesthetic being part of it. The quote goes on to say, for LeVay, Satanism is also the religion of the playful provocateur. Anything that will shock people out of their unthinking adherence to the status quo is worth thinking about or even doing.
Mm,
So, including making up history.
yeah.
And it's that oh was it the start? We talked about this before, I think. Was it the start of a Baudrillard book where Ecclesiastes is mentioned and quoted, and no such quote exists in Ecclesiastes?
Mhm.
And it's quoted again and again. You're like, he was already showing something. I'm probably misquoting it now, but that idea that like you can make something up to prove your point in that way to already that it's how do you fuck the same theorists that are going to support your work? Uh, because I do think when you abandon yourself over to the mythic living or magical living of allegory as daily life,
Mm,
facts become something completely different. And
yeah.
that's not to say that it's not the same as overt lying, because on one judgment side it is, but in another world it is not intently the same as
Right.
lying.
Right. There
And
can
that
be
becomes, or otherwise ritual itself is a lie.
right,
Uh,
right, right. Fiction is not the same as lying if you're telling truths that are useful to humans, even if, that thing never like historically happened.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I
And there's
think,
plenty of his living that wasn't just like claiming to have dated Marilyn Monroe or have worked as a police photographer or stuff. Like he did walk Zoltan his Black Panther around. Like
yeah,
he did do a bunch of stuff. He did these, high profile satanic weddings and the satanic baptisms and stuff like that, which is also addressing like, yes, it's definitely media fodder, and it's building his platform and grandifying is that word, making grand his project, but there's also a
brand
sense that
digitization.
yeah,
Yes.
there's also a sense of like doing things that a church does, right? Like providing to a community of a sort.
Yeah, certainly. I think I don't want to falsely misrepresent him because I'm in the different not being a Church of Satanist by any means. Um, but just in talking that certainly the official position of the church that it's an atheistic humanistic tradition. And that many feel that yes, that's something that's been more established by Peter and post LaVeyan times, but that's the official stance. The church as an entity has a certain right to revamp itself as many times as it fucking wants.
Right.
But its worth with LaVey of like, okay, the Satanic Bible, which was they credit Rosemary's Baby with the Satanic Bible being able to be published. Like, it
Right.
was just one of those things around the time period that it was the perfect storm of things. But you get those 9 satanic statements, right? 1, Satan represents indulgence instead of abstinence. Okay. 2, Satan represents vital essence instead of spiritual pipe dreams. 3, Satan represents undefiled wisdom instead of hypocritical self-deceit. 4, Satan represents kindness to those who deserve it instead of love wasted on ingrates. 5, Satan represents vengeance instead of turning the other cheek. 6, Satan represents responsibility to the responsible instead of concern for psychic vampires. 7, Satan represents man as just another animal who, because of his, quote, divine spiritual and intellectual development, quote unquote, has become the most vicious animal of all. 8, Satan represents all of the so-called sins as they all lead to physical, mental, or emotional gratification. 9, Satan has been the best friend the church has ever had, and he has kept it in business all these years. So like, there's a humor to that as well as a wisdom to all of that, right? Like, it's one of those things of everything starts with represents except the last one, which is an attack on established religion. And there's more than that. There's the 11 satanic rules of the earth, and there's all those different the satanic sins and everything that are in the Bible. And the Bible is probably the text par excellence that needs to be acknowledged as like, this is the thing. Like, rule number 9 of do not harm little children. 10, do not harm non-human animals unless you are attacked or for your food. Like, these are reasons that these already change things from the perceptions of Satanism. But the problem is the Mandela affecting, and I use that liberally, that term, in its most liberalized form of saying that all Satanism has always been this, and the way that Wicca has kind of co-opted history. There we go. And unfortunately starts to talk about 17th century occultists as if they are members of Gardner's Wicca. And they have not, that's not invented yet. There might even be pre-roots in some of those occult scenes in certain areas of England, but we do not see it calling something by modern nomenclature that has a specific set of tenets and putting it back on the past. Satanism does exist in fin de siècle France, right? Like what are you going to do? It's there. And it is not necessarily the Satanism of LaVey. And I think that that's an important side, that LaVey doesn't own Satanism in that way, because Satanism is not a set, it's an accusation, and at best, a Christian heresy, which a lot of people don't like to address. At what point does it go from Christian heresy and accusation into, we don't actually believe in Satan, but we're going to use that term because it provokes you, which is the point of view of many COS people, to no, Satan has always been there, always was, and has guided everything that we've done in like the Temple of Set. And they're not the only ones. And then by the time you get to like, sorry, apparently I'm still caffeinated. By the time you get to the modern one, the Temple of Satan, right? Where it starts to change, and this is more done as a reaction to conservative culture wars than it is against Christianity itself, where Satanism is being used as a way to fight back against Christian majority politics, but is not necessarily concerned with tenets that are anything other than political, of like, how do you claim abortion as it's a religious right to forcibly miscarry a fetus in your religion? Well, you can make that now, it's protected, right? So which one are you going to decide on, church and state? Let's go with it. That type of shit, like that I respect the game at play, but is also obviously a very different thing than the COS Temple of Set divide that did happen and continues to kind of frame a lot of like 90s narrative around, well, it's atheistic versus theistic, or it's, now is it political or apolitical in that way. And I'm curious to see where it will go, given the rise of conservatism and fascism within culture at large, and especially as justified by certain occult members. But again, we have that whole, certain types of magic are absolutely born of privilege, and certain are born out of necessity. And that will always be a war that I think is there. And I look forward to someone writing a thesis on it and then elucidating to me as how I am wrong.
How's that for an adversary?
Yeah. Adversary. I think the funny thing about it is like, okay, like spark it up, right? Like there was my transition.
Right. Yeah. If you're going to be inflammatory, what are you setting fire to, and what are you
Yeah,
warming yourself by, and what are you going to chip away at?
yes, indeed. What shall we chip away at? So, in the interest of being complete, because why the fuck not at this point?
Mhm.
Um, right. And I don't think we've ever done the stone last, but hi, Flint. How are you? Um, Fred, Wilma, and so on. Bam, bam, bam. Okay. So Flint, Flintstone, is a quartzite, right? It's part of the quartz family.
Mhm.
And we see it used early to make stone tools and to start fires. So both as the means by which to um, make the red stuff visible
Mhm.
in a rubic action, as well as to make things inflammatory,
Yeah.
and to bring fire to something, which is interesting, right? For me, I think it's interesting that it's both. It's used as a weapon to what feels like fire, the parting of the flesh,
Mhm.
as well as in a napping way to nap and make the edge sharp, as well as the very thing that will make sparks.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That it's literally called the Firestone at various points. Yeah, as well as flins and vlint from Old English and Old High German and Middle Dutch are all referring to splinters of hard rock, or a small, sharp, solid cylinder in some cases as well. Um, that it itself divides the people that study it by its very language as well. Archaeologists and historians often use flint, whereas geologists prefer to talk about chert. Um, if the stone is used to make tools, then it's likely flint, because they are used interchangeably by some people, but they're also understood to have different properties, and chert isn't very good for napping.
mm,
Um, the other thing I found interesting, along with, yeah, we'll talk about calcification versus calcination. It's not entirely certain how it is formed, which is always fun. There's a mystery to it. So it occurs in masses and nodules in sedimentary rock, like chalks and limestones. And apparently it forms in shapes that even geologists call odd looking at various points. So we know it's some kind of chemical change in compressed sedimentary rock, in the formation and in its interactions between water and rock, between what various microbes are doing, and obviously like immense pressures and things like that. But it's likely that it's the result of the same kind of stuff that goes on when little things eat into organic material and then gets filled with the rock, like the way not exactly the same, but petrification of various sorts, turning things that weren't rock into rock. And certainly there's types of flint from like all over the south coast of England and like the other side of the channel as well, which have trapped fossilized marine flora in there. If they find pieces of coral and vegetation preserved inside flint in the same way that you find insects and bits of plant within amber. Um, it's also found in these weird nodules that seem to have produced natural bangles as well. So there are flint bracelets that have been found in ancient Egyptian tombs, and at least one workshop seems to have excavated that was like putting them together. But some of them seem naturally formed. That like there's this Victorian archaeologist talked about how they would find these nodules with a ring around them and described it like Saturn with his ring, and that the central boss could be detached carefully, and then the ring could be used and made into bangles. And they find like a body in Abydos with like 7 flint bracelets on the left arm and one on the right. So yay, making jewelry out of cool things. But primarily, yeah, it's used to make a variety of cutting tools like knife blades, axe heads, spear heads, arrow heads. Also scrapers, like a really significant part of like scraping things, making hides, doing all sorts of stuff that is flexible with that sharpness. And that like, not only do these stone tools date back more than 3 million years, and there's also an interesting part of that like um, uh, we know that because flint is durable, and so we can date it well. So We don't know, the tools that didn't last. There's a what do they call that? The survivor bias, right? In terms of that, but in general, it's stone tools like define the Stone Age itself has a very long history with humanity, especially if we define history as that which we have records for. So along with this history, you also get it in a lot of so not just cutting with the blade, but also the fact that it's fire starting is not just for fires or cooking or heat. It is the flintlock mechanism as well, right? Still found in lighters. You can still buy flints for your Zippos and stuff, which I find like a great ingredient for fiery charm bundles that won't contain actual flammable materials like match heads or whatever. Yeah, fascinating, weird little rock. Yeah, crops up all over the place. A record of those who come before us, as well as still being used for what it's used for. I mean, less so in flintlock rifles, I guess, but but certainly still in the flame that you can carry in your pocket.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that fascinates me with flint is the full circle it goes from being, whether the other name of weaponry flint or fire flint, and the division there is often gendered in older anthropological texts,
Hmm.
right? Excuse me, of male flint and female flint, of being, yes, man make fire, but women have to preserve fire. And I being deliberately ironic in my speech here. Also, the whole thing of like gatherer hunter is probably more accurate. But that through a little bit of human progress, we primarily end up using it for fire, mostly for quite some time, until the invention of gunpowder, and then it comes full force back again as like, this is what we need, this is how we conquer, this is how we take. So flint always has this consuming hunger behind it, and I can't help but associate it with obsidian within Mesoamerica, and how things go in that way.
Dragon glass.
Yes. Yeah, this association for me with because even tecpat within Aztec, which is itself a word that was invented in the 1800s to basically distance Mexico from its own heritage. But Aztec Mexica culture, tecpat, or tecpate in more modern Nahuatl, but I gotta love that sound, right? Tecpat is flint or obsidian, and is a double-edged blade that's elongated, and it's often painted as half red, with a consciousness, with an animistic face attached to it, with fangs, meaning it's hungry. But it is the flint blade itself is a whitened, a pale feature, and that the blood keeps it red. It is born in hunger, and that this is the knife was traditionally used as a kind of short range weapon too by the ones who came in the night, the Jaguar warriors, mythically as we know them. And the sharp edges would have been smart. There were other weapons that were flint or obsidian based. The kind of broad sword that was used by the Aztecs, and the Atlatls themselves, that also incorporated stone because they're non-metal culture. But the origin of tecpat is quite fascinating, because tecpat is born in heaven and it's shaped as a knife. So it's born, and the brother of it when it's born is so afeared of it, or the mother, depending on who you're talking about, but it falls down to the earth, and it splits the earth open at Chicomostok, the place of seven caves, and then fragmenting into 1,600 pieces. And from those fragments, 1,600 gods emerge. These are the first gods on earth. So there's the starry realm, which birthed it, but it falls to the earth because they recognize that it can tear the worlds apart. And they throw Tecpat down into the earth. And so you get this primal place where Chicomostok is also where people came out of the earth. So this is a metaphor too, that in the current age, you have the gods that are born from in this current age, but you also have gods that are in the sky that are from previous ages, as well as gods in the underground that are from previous ages, and that people, being the descendants of the bones of our ancestors, animated by breath, Quetzalcoatl, and the living shadow of what has been, Xolotl, that somehow people emerge from this cave as well. So the wound that is put into the earth into our mother, the Lord of the Earth, is where, and this is flint, is one of the, we don't know whether to call it flint or obsidian, because it's both. It's that sharp stone that cuts. And so there's something interesting to me in that way. So yeah. Anyway,
Yeah,
uh,
that's fascinating. Yeah, yeah. The blade of time. Uh, that was not a good summation. I'm trying to think while I'm being inspired. Brain, mouth, things. Uh, yeah,
yeah. So like you have in the version where the Senso Mishkoa, Mimishkoa, excuse me, the 400 cloud snakes, which
mm,
400 is kind of like the infinite number.
right,
There's a lot that emerged from there. The mother is Citlanique, so Citlanique or Imatecutli, whatever we want to call her, is the star garment. That is the mother who is um, sometimes both the creator of the Milky Way, but also the Milky Way itself. And
right.
so this is uh, as connected to the first pair of humans, not the Nena, or 13 flower and one crocodile, and how they go through all these different things. This is the 13th day of the month is governed by this mother, who then gives birth through the wisdom of the previous 13-day period, gives birth to the next period
Mm,
of 13 days. So it's
mhm.
always the 13th day is seen as the pregnant mother, who then gives birth to the number one of the next calendrical cycle.
Gotcha.
So
Yeah.
yeah, and so I find this connection between Tekbat, who is associated with the north and the land of the dead, which is stillness and the privation and the lack of like there's nothing left, right? That's the goal of Mictlan, right? Is to bring all to stasis and nothingness. It is not to let everybody live happily ever after. This is decay, and that what you have in this life will flee from you. Eventually you will be nothing, and we are all dust. And even though the heroes that are in heaven, they become nameless heroes in time, and that even if they are carrying the sun as
Mm,
heroes in the morning, or as women who died in childbirth in the afternoon, that eventually they are part and parcel of that journey and lose their own identity in that. So like there is
mm,
glory, but we as humans succumb to the stillness of anonymity, that our bones are ground down to make masa for the next generation, and that the gods will do this better in time.
mm,
That it's all a learning process, even for the gods, who
mm,
themselves could die and have
mm,
take on numerous forms. And the gods themselves are not static identities in a Mexica cosmology, and they're inheriting this, of course, from their own kind of like Nahuatl, Uroaztecan understanding of things, but also incorporating all the various mythologies they can in order to become empire, right? They're going to justify empire somehow, so
right.
the myths got to come in. But the idea of colliding um, two flints, one, if you don't have metal, because it's not a metal-based culture, is still that Tekpak becomes associated with Xietecutli, who's the Lord of the Fire, the God of Day. And this is an important aspect to understand the miracle of each day. That just as two flints don't necessarily produce a spark all the time, or that some sparks must be kindled more, and you must have the qualities of the kindle are hard, because you might not have the powder or the dry tinder as much as you need in order to capture that spark. That similarly, some days are harder than others, and that a miracle of a day where you wake up and feel pretty good is a
Mm,
miracle.
mm,
And that side of it, of like even the grinding of fire sticks, using a fire stick, where the gods themselves put fire into the human body. That this itself should not be taken as for granted either, because this is an incredibly difficult, labor-intensive act on behalf of the divine energies, and the divine energy was wasted if you don't do something with your life.
mm,
And so the idea being that energy, which is Theos, which everything is bound to, and which the Virgin of Guadalupe specifically says she's the mother of, that divine energy of Theos. She doesn't use the Spanish there. She says Dios, the Spanish God, and Theos, meaning
mm,
all divine energy that manipulates things that can be manipulated in all of this. So I think the Tekbak is a very hard day to be born on.
mm,
There's a lot of myth around it. But there's a lot of myth around this idea of the flint knife. It's weird, consuming nature, that it is connected to both the sun god and to the god of death, Mictlantecutli, and that there is on also Tuhuizlipochtli, the war god, who's the patron of the city that fell. And so, like, it's also one thing to glorify, and as I say this, the kind of wonderful things we can study in retrospect about how a culture did do things, but also that the culture, there are no more, say, let's per se Aztecs, but the indigenous culture of Mexico continues on living, and is a living culture which is inheriting Spanish conquest and Catholicism and the aftermath of disease and conversion and colonization, that these things also are incorporated within many modern communities in different ways and mean different things. So it's not to hold up the written record as the only one, but
Right.
certainly tied into sacrifice, certainly tied into the tongue of the earth god, the tongue of the sun, as it waits for the blood energy, which could be symbolic as well. But that anything that is hungry is depicted with a flint knife as the tongue of,
Huh.
like, I am thirsty, I desire liquor, I desire water, I desire blood.
Mm.
Rain is called the liquor of the earth, right? Tlaloc. So yeah, anyway,
Hmm.
I could go off on that a lot and continue, but I think that's probably enough cultural specificity there.
That's
So if
amazing.
you're hungry, you just have a flint knife in your mouth. Uh, yeah.
Oh, the blade that hungers. Yeah. Huh. Yeah. And what do we do with that? Right. It was the Patakino is reading about the tongue being described as both the worst thing in the world and the best thing in the world.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, even the notion that, okay, so I think when they were excavating the Templo Mayor, so if you go to Mexico City, of course, it's built upon the remnants of Tenochtitlan, so the Aztec, the Mexica capital. And there are a lot of things that they thought were symbolic, or things that people had heard about and we didn't necessarily find. We have found carved images of Ozompantli, where there's like stylized heads on a rack, and you hear the Spaniards talking about it, but we also have found skulls on a rack. And some of that is even more modern, because it's such a modern thing to care about what you find.
Mm.
So disrupting the largest city in the world, the most polluted, the most, one of the more deadly cities in the world, to disrupt the flow of traffic and commerce, to take care of something that is anthropological,
Mm.
archaeological, is already a new value. But
Mm.
anyway, in the excavations, there was a Tzompantli of 33 skull masks that are all showing Mictlantecutli in some way, the Lord of Mictlan, the Lord of the Dead. And so they have shell and pyrite in the eyes, kind of embedded within each other to make a pupil within the eye. And then they have flint knives coming out of the mouth and nasal cavities. So you have the breath that is gone. They desire breath. They
Mm.
desire breath, like the gods might desire blood, like we desire water and food. That,
Mm.
that the hunger for the dead to be able to be alive again is prominent.
Mm.
Um, and this nature of, yes, through offering, through our breath, through our donated breath, through the aroma of the food we give them, we can see these cultural markers that are going to carry over into modern interpretations of Dia de los Muertos. You can tell I'm from LA because they say Dia de los Muertos instead of Dia de Muertos, which is more common in Mexico.
Mhm.
Um, but a lot of our cultural trappings that we associate with Dia de Muertos in the north still come from the south, and come from more Maya, Zapotec, Olmec, these cultures that pave the way for this. And a lot of the Mexican identity is based in, like, again, assuming that all Mexican indigenous are one, and just
Right.
kind of playing it out there. But that was a whole different diatribe I didn't expect. So
I'd not encountered much of that before. That was awesome. Yeah, I'm gonna be thinking about a flint tongue and yeah, the from the nose, the breath, right? Yeah, yeah. How fire and air and the fire within and the air without all interact, and friction and sheer strengths. Ha! Love it.
uh-huh.
Love
Yeah.
it.
And it's also interesting too. It speaks to something too, of like, we have each of us with identities. I mean, as people, you and I have like what we what we show on the show, what we show in our personal lives, what we show with each other, and we can blur those lines. But it's funny to realize, like, I don't necessarily talk explicitly about Aztec things or Mexica things or Mayan things or Otomi things here on this show as much. But maybe there's times where I can figure out how to fucking put it in, because it
Oh
is a
yeah.
big passion of mine as well. Both for ancestry reasons, but also just to put a lot of time and study into those things.
Oh
But
yeah.
yeah, so expect more. I don't know. Expect more of myself. Anyway,
Well,
I
if we can talk about figures and their attendant astrological stuff, I want to hear some more of that astrological material, that calendrical material.
yeah
And it's the cosmology that you talk about through that, and the way of thinking about the body and community and engagement with spiritual ecologies and progress and the movement of time, I should say.
yeah. Who knows? Perhaps in time we'll do in addition to maybe a decan.
Mm.
Could be interesting of astrological decan. But also one of the day signs, because there's 20, and we have 20 episodes that go through them all, and then eventually move on to something else. But
Heck yeah.
uh, uh, just to add more information for the we're plagued with the goat in the garden. So are you. Uh, but yeah, okay. So I think we've covered everything. I think we have a little bit of Iñati of Ignatius Loyola,
Mhm.
Haristum, Brasa, frankincense, flint, calcination, with a little bit of calcification. We have Fortuna Major, Owani Meiji in there, temperance, and
Mhm.
Anton Levey,
Mhm.
and a little bit of exploration there. So on this, the most brief of our episodes, you come to me with this problem on one of the most brief of our episodes. Um, but it's lovely as always to rant with you. It's always
Yeah.
a which I appreciate. Of like there are times where I feel like you're gonna have to push me off the soapbox, and there's times where I'll be like, no, this is definitely a good soapbox, and we'll let Al talk, and I need to shut the fuck up. But I appreciate that there's always like we're facing the same way.
Yeah.
And so here's the camaraderie and
Oh.
and uh, the brotherhood of man and the I don't know the fathership of split knives. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah. A good
yeah,
fire is better shared, right? Stared into in company. Yeah,
yeah. And
definitely.
if one of you and like if one of you is the order of carrots and cabbage, then the other one needs to be the fucking Peter Rabbit. Like go after it. You can switch roles. It's fun.
Mhm.
Um, anyway, so yeah, may all your fires be such that you can utilize them to good aim and perhaps handle safely.
Mm.
May all your subfumigations uplift you because I invoke frankincense in its absence in this formula. Um, and
Yeah,
may
may you
all
appreciate the good shit.
yeah, I mean, yeah, appreciate the good shit when it's in front of you, and may all astrological elections be in favor for my working ahead.
Hmm.
That Calcifer loves us, but calcification is different. Uh, calcination is a good way to not get caught with really rare ingredients, but also just a really easy way to borrow from alchemy's language in order to justify collecting weird shit. Uh,
Yeah, may you keep your dries dry and your wets wet.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So you
Philosophical calcination is a good friend of ours.
uh-huh.
Um,
Uh-huh.
uh,
May you make good mixes and syntheses.
uh,
Uh
may all of your sense be grounded in earth and water, so that you can carry the good fortune that has been granted you, and seed them. Well, that sounds really different.
oh,
Yes, so that
yeah.
you can feed them. Um,
May your armor fit perfectly and guard you against the slings and arrows of outrageous greater fortune, and may you not get stuck in
may greater fortune just flip off of you like it's nothing. Like
it.
pass. May you collect the arrows of greater fortune that have flung off your enemy's armor.
Ah,
Um, and
and make
who loves
tons
a
of
good
them.
Easter egg hunt?
Hmm.
And a little water in wine when the wine is strong is not so bad. But if you're getting $3 chuck, then maybe you don't put water in it.
All things in moderation, especially moderation.
Yeah, especially moderation. All things in moderation, unless it's a good vermouth. That's the perfect balance. To just have at it.
May your youthful fire light a furnace that burns all life long.
Yes. And when in doubt, shave your head in the name of Walpurgis Nacht and the devil.
May you look great in a sweet high-collared cape.
Yeah, exactly. Leave Anton LaVey alone. And Brittany. So with that, Golgothites, if you're still listening, good on you. And we will broadcast from the depths of an undisclosed location soon again for the very 38th time. So check us out at radiofreegolgotha.com for updated ideas about lectures, so that Al and I have guests at talks, and look at Facebook for folk necromancy groups, so you can help us make content. And there's the Salem conference coming up, which many of you probably already know about, and finite time and whatever. But there's probably always a Salem conference coming up, so look into it. Talk there, see us there. Throw tomatoes. I'm only there for a couple of days, so figure out which days I'm there.
And make sure that tomato is nice and stinky.
Yeah. And I do believe we'll have plans for another speakeasy at some point this year, but maybe only one. So keep tuned. Keep tuned. Keep tuned, and something.
Cheers very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure, and thank you, Jesse.
Right. Thank you. Cheers to us. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.